The craftsman's hands were already steady when he walked in, and it was that steadiness that told Mira Voss the decision had already been made somewhere she was not invited. She had been in labor for 11 hours. She was 23 years old, and she had spent 3 years in this household, learning that the most important information was always the information no one told you directly. You gathered it from other things, from the way servants moved when a certain name was mentioned, from the way conversation stopped when you walked into a room, from the way men gathered outside closed doors and believed that speaking softly was the same as speaking privately. For the past 4 hours, the voices in the hallway had been low and final, in a way she recognized. She had known, somewhere in her body before she knew it in her mind, that something about this night was not just about the birth. The birth was the occasion. The occasion was not the point. The midwife was a woman named Hesse, who had been delivering children in the northern mountain pack for 30 years, and whose hands never stopped moving, always doing the next necessary thing. Hesse had gone very quiet in the last hour, not the silence of concentration, the silence of a woman who had been told something and instructed to stay out of it. The baby came at 4 minutes past midnight. She arrived into the cold stone room with no announcement and no ceremony, and she made one sound upon arrival, one sharp sound that was too aware and too deliberate for a newborn, and then she went quiet, not the quiet of fear, the quiet of a creature that had arrived somewhere new and was already taking stock of it. Mira reached for her before Hesse had finished the first check. She pulled the baby against her chest and held on, and Hesse, who was not a cruel woman, did not stop her. The baby's eyes were silver. They were open wider than newborn eyes usually opened, and they found Mira's face quickly, in the way eyes find what they are looking for, rather than the way eyes wander until they happen upon something. They were steady in a way that did not feel accidental. Serafina, Mira said, against her daughter's ear. She had kept the name written on a folded square of paper inside her left boot for 4 months, because it was the only decision in this pregnancy that had still belonged entirely to her. Your name is Serafina. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, that does not change. 12 minutes passed. Then the door opened, and the night became what she had known it would be. Crest Voss came in first. He was a tall, broad man who had learned to carry authority so naturally that it had stopped looking like something he wore, and started looking like something he was made of. He looked at the baby for 3 seconds, then at Mira. "How is she?" he said. "She is perfect," Mira said. She held Serafina tighter, without appearing to. "Good." He looked over his shoulder, and the other men came in. 2 were elders of the Iron Blood Pack. Gareth was the older one, a man whose calm was not warmth but the self-possession of someone who had never in his adult life had a decision challenged successfully. Cole was younger and harder, from a family so embedded in the pack's power structure that questioning them had simply stopped happening over the generations. Behind both of them came the craftsman with the wooden case. He set the case on the table near the window. He opened it and began arranging its contents, with the patient focus of a man who had been hired to do a job and intended to do it well and quickly. Mira looked past him at what was inside the case, and the cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the mountain night outside. A collar, narrow, made from a silver-colored metal that was not ordinary silver. She could tell that immediately from the way it held the candlelight, from the slight weight the air around it seemed to carry. Along its entire surface, pressed into the metal during its making, were small, dense markings she recognized as binding runes, the kind that became part of the object permanently, the kind that could not be filed off or melted out or dissolved by anything an ordinary person had access to. It had been made small, sized for an infant's throat. "No," Mira said. No one had spoken to her yet. She said it anyway, before anything else could be said first. Crest met her eyes. "Mira." "No," she said again. Her voice was level. She was surprised by how level it was. Inside her chest, everything was moving at once, but her voice came out clear and still, and she decided to keep it that way. Gareth stepped forward, folding his hands in the manner of men who have practiced appearing reasonable. The agreement between the Iron Blood Pack and the Blackthorn clan was ratified by the full Elder Council 4 months ago. The terms were specific. The binding must be placed within the first hours of the birth for the runes to anchor properly to the bloodline. This was not a decision made tonight, Mira. Tonight is simply the completion of what was already settled. "She is 12 minutes old," Mira said. She has not made any choices in her 12 minutes alive, because she has spent them being born. You are placing a permanent binding on a child who cannot yet understand what you are doing or why. The pack has been in a border dispute with the Blackthorn clan for 11 years, Cole said. He said it patiently, the way adults say things to children who are asking obvious questions. 11 years of failed trade negotiations, of border incidents, of losses no one gets to stop counting. Dorian Blackthorn is the Blackthorn heir. A formally sealed mating contract between our bloodlines ends the conflict. It restores the trade routes. It stops the losses at the border. He paused. This is what is best for the pack.
I was not consulted, Mira said. Pack bloodline contracts fall under the Elder Council's authority, Gareth said. That has been the structure of this pack long before you or I arrived in it.
Mira looked around the room. She looked at Hessa, who had her eyes on the window. She looked at Berta, Crest's mother, who had been sitting in the corner since before the birth, and who now stood up and walked out of the room without a word, the door swinging shut with a flat, resolved sound behind her. She looked at the two guards near the door, young men who were keeping their gaze carefully to the left of her, looking at the wall, which was the look of people who had received their instructions, and were following them, and had chosen not to look at what those instructions were being applied to. She held Serafina. The craftsman looked at Crest. Crest gave one nod. The two guards came toward her. They moved carefully, gently even. They took her arms with the particular gentleness of people who have been told to be gentle, and they held them with enough firmness that she could not move. And Mira made one sound, one that she had not planned and could not stop, and then she was quiet, because there was nothing left that sound could accomplish in this room right now. The craftsman worked quickly. He had a professional efficiency that said he had done this before, not many times, but enough that the steps were familiar. The collar was placed. He made a brief series of movements, and the runes along the collar's surface lit for a moment, cold and exact, and then faded into the metal, as though they had always been there, and had simply been waiting to be recognized. Serafina made a sound. There is no word that precisely describes what she heard her daughter make in that moment. It was not a cry, though it carried the shape of one. It was something a throat makes when something has been taken from it, before it ever had the chance to know it possessed it. Something between refusal and recognition. Something that said, in the only language available to a child, 12 minutes into the world, that this was not right, and that this being not right was something that would not be forgotten. And then it stopped. Serafina went very quiet. Her silver eyes were open. She looked at the ceiling, then at Mira, and she stayed there, held close, with the collar at her throat and the runes fully settled into the metal, and she was still and watching. The craftsman closed his case. The elders departed. The guards stepped back. Crest stood at the foot of the bed for a moment. The runes suppress the shift instinct, he said. Nothing more. She will develop normally, in every other way. Her health, her intelligence, her growth. The only effect is that her wolf cannot fully express itself until the formal bond with Dorian is completed at the appropriate time. It is not a harm, Mira. It is a precaution. He left. Hessa came and finished her checks without speaking. When she was done, she pressed Mira's hand once, briefly, and went out. The room was quiet. The candles burned. The mountain wind moved under the door. The collar caught the candlelight in a thin, steady line. Mira held her daughter and looked at her face for a long time. The silver eyes, the serious, small mouth, the absolute stillness of a child who had arrived in an unfair world and had not yet decided to be afraid of it. I am sorry, Mira said once, simply, not as an excuse and not as an explanation, but because it was true, and her daughter deserved to hear it said plainly. Serafina looked at her. She did not look away. 6 weeks passed. The house returned to its ordinary pace. Crest went back to his meetings. The elders returned to their work. The pack absorbed what had happened, the way packs absorb things, folding it into the ongoing story of what had been necessary, and what decisions had been made for the greater good. Mira learned the collar the way she learned everything that mattered, quietly, methodically, and without telling anyone what she was doing. She learned that the metal it was made from was called moonsilver, and that moonsilver's properties made it resistant to every ordinary tool known in the pack. She learned that the runes it carried were of the anchor variety, meaning they were designed to suppress the shift instinct at its root so thoroughly that only the completion of the bond they were keyed to could reverse the suppression. She learned, from watching her daughter, that Serafina's wolf was already present, already aware, already pushing, in small brief moments, against the walls the collar had built around it. Serafina would go still sometimes, not the still of sleep or calm, the still of something gathering itself against a resistance. Her tiny hands would clench, and her silver eyes would focus on something only she could perceive, and then the moment would pass, and she would relax, and the collar would sit unchanged at her throat, and Mira would look at her daughter and feel a complex mix of grief and something that was almost pride. Then, 6 weeks after the birth, Ada came. Ada appeared in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon without having knocked. She sat down at the kitchen table with her tall walking stick leaning against the wall and her eyes already on the door to the next room, where Serafina was resting. She was old in a way that made the word old insufficient. She was the kind of woman people in the Northern Territories referred to in careful, respectful language, the way they referred to old agreements and old forest paths, and things that had been present in the land longer than most living memory could account for. She smelled of pine resin, old rain, and something underneath both that had no clean name. Mira studied her from the kitchen doorway. She had heard of Ada. She looked at the woman for a long moment, and then, without knowing exactly why, brought Serafina in from the next room. Ada held the baby with the assurance of someone who had held many children across many years and had never dropped any of them. She looked at the collar. She looked at the runes, barely visible now in the settled metal. She looked at Serafina's eyes, which looked steadily back. The bloodline reading they did before she was born was accurate, Ada said. Not a question, a statement. There is a dominant strain in this child's wolf line that appears very rarely, every few generations, in the right bloodline combination. When it appears, it produces something the pack structure is not easily designed to contain. She turned the baby gently, studying her. If this child grows into what her bloodline suggests, she will be one of the most powerful wolves born in these mountains in a very long time. Strong enough, aware enough, and sure enough of herself that she would have no natural reason to remain in a place she had not chosen. Ada looked at Mira. The elders knew this from the reading. The blackthorn deal was real, but it was also useful. A suppressive collar on a girl with this bloodline was something the council intended to arrange regardless. The trade agreement gave them a reason that sounded like statesmanship instead of what it actually was. Fear, Mira said. Fear, Ada agreed. She looked at Serafina one last time, directly, the way someone looks at something they are saying something true and permanent to. They collared you because they saw what you would become. But what a person will become is not a thing that metal changes. Metal can delay it. Metal cannot stop it. She handed Serafina back to Mira, stood, collected her walking stick, and left the kitchen. Her footsteps faded down the hallway. The front door opened and closed. Mira stood in the kitchen with her daughter in her arms, and Ada's words moving through her mind like water finding the shape of the ground it runs over. They had been afraid of Serafina before she was born. They had seen something in the bloodline and responded to it with metal and runes and a political contract that gave their fear a more acceptable name. They had looked at an unborn child and decided that the safest thing to do was to make sure she never fully became what she was capable of becoming. Mira looked at the collar at her daughter's throat, then at her daughter's face, then at the silver eyes that looked back at her with the same calm attention they had shown from the first minute. She made a decision that afternoon. She did not announce it or write it down. She simply decided, completely and with the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped arguing with what must be done and started doing it, that Serafina Voss would not be caught unprepared when the time came to use whatever it was that the elders had been afraid enough of to put metal around before her first breath. Mira knew herbs. She knew which plants masked scent and which settled the body, and which sharpened the mind under pressure. She knew the old tracking methods that her own mother had taught her in the years before she came to the northern mountains. She knew how to move through a forest without leaving the kind of trail that experienced hunters could follow. She began the next morning, in small ways, with a child too young to understand what she was being taught, but not too young to absorb it. She did not know at that point how long she would have. What she knew was that whatever time she had, she would use completely. And far to the south, in the Blackthorn territory, a boy named Dorian was growing up, knowing that his future had been arranged, and finding, unlike the silver-eyed child in the north, that he was entirely satisfied with that. The first thing Serafina understood about her place in the Ironblood pack was that she occupied a different kind of space than everyone else in it. She was 7 years old the first time she understood this, with the kind of clarity that stays with you for the rest of your life, and the understanding came not from being told, but from watching. She had walked toward a group of pack children playing in the long meadow behind the eastern houses. It was the kind of afternoon game that pack children played in late summer, full of movement and noise and the easy wildness of children who knew where they belonged and what they were. She had crossed the grass toward them the way any child approaches a group she wants to join, openly and without particular caution. They had not moved away all at once. It was not organized or discussed. One child noticed her coming and drifted sideways. Then another followed, the way children follow each other's small decisions without needing to know the reason. Then 2 more. By the time Serafina reached the place where they had been standing, she was standing in an empty section of meadow, and the group had relocated to the far side of the field, their game continuing as if nothing had interrupted it. She stood there for a moment. The collar at her throat caught the afternoon sun. She had already understood, by age 7, that the collar was the first thing people's eyes went to when they looked at her. Not always consciously, not always unkindly, but there was a reflex in it, a quick look and then a quick look away, and what lived in that brief space between looking and looking away was something she did not yet have a name for but understood in her body. It was the reflex of people who have been told, in one way or another, that this person is spoken for, that this person's situation is complicated, that it is easier to keep a certain distance. Serafina did not cry. She turned around and walked back toward the house and thought, very methodically for a 7-year-old, about what had just happened. She understood 2 things by the time she reached the door. The first was that the collar made her marked in a way that kept people uncertain around her. The second was that being kept at a distance meant she had a great deal of uninterrupted time to watch, and watching, she was already discovering, was something she was exceptionally good at. She watched the elders. She watched the way they moved through the pack, who they spoke to, and who they dismissed, where their authority was applied with the most force, and where it became gentler, because the person it was applied to had enough of their own standing to require careful handling. She watched Crest, her father, who was powerful in a way that she studied the way you study a weather pattern, not because you love the weather, but because knowing how it moves is how you stay safe. She watched Gareth, the senior elder, who she understood was the man who had ratified the contract that had put the collar on her. She watched him, and she memorized him, not his face, which was ordinary enough, but his patterns. How he started every important meeting, with 3 minutes of seemingly casual talk, before moving to the real subject. How he always stood slightly to the left of the center of the room, a position that let him see the door, without appearing to watch it. How his voice dropped in pitch when he was absolutely certain of something, and rose slightly when he was less certain than he appeared. She filed all of this away in the part of her mind she came to think of as the archive, the place where she kept things she did not yet know how to use, but understood she would need. The collar's effect on her was something she also studied, as objectively as she could manage. She could feel her wolf. That was the first and most important thing she discovered. The collar did not erase it or kill it or make it absent. It was there, a steady heat running through her bones, a presence that felt like a second self inhabiting the same body. What the collar did was put a wall between that presence and its full expression. She could feel her wolf pressing against that wall sometimes, not always, not continuously, but in moments when her emotions were strong, the pressing became unmistakable. The first time the collar did something she had not expected, she was 12 years old. An older pack boy named Owen had said something to her in the yard of the main house, something mean about the collar, about what it meant that she was bound to a man she had never met. Said it in the way that older children sometimes say cruel things to younger ones, casually, as if it does not require any particular effort to do damage, because it does not. Serafina had looked at him and felt something move through her that was not like anything she had felt before. It was not sadness, it was not embarrassment. It was rage, clean and hot and perfectly aimed, rising from somewhere deep in her chest and expanding outward. And the collar hummed. It was barely audible. She felt it more than heard it, a vibration against the skin of her throat, and then a tightening that was not painful, but was definite. A reminder, a correction, the way a leash corrects. And the rage, instead of being released, was pushed back inward, where it continued to burn, hotter now, nowhere to go. Owen had walked away without noticing anything. Serafina had stood very still in the yard for 3 minutes, breathing deliberately, until the humming stopped. That was when she understood that the collar was not simply suppressive, it was responsive. It tightened when she felt something too strongly. When her wolf surged toward the surface, the collar reacted. It was designed to manage not just the shift, but the emotion that preceded the shift. Designed to keep her not just contained but calm. Designed to produce a version of her that was quieter and more manageable than the version her bloodline intended her to be. She kept this information in the archive. She thought about it for a long time. She did not discuss it with anyone, except her mother. Mira listened to everything Serafina told her about the collar. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the many things Serafina respected about her mother. When she was finished, Mira was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is useful information. That means it has limits. Anything that reacts has limits, because reaction requires a trigger, and triggers can be controlled." "You mean I can learn to manage what I feel, so it does not trigger the collar?" Serafina said. "That is part of it," Mira said. "But I also mean that something that has to respond to what you feel is working against you, rather than simply working. And things that have to work against you eventually exhaust themselves." Serafina had spent a long time thinking about that. She was not friendless, precisely. There were a handful of pack members who treated her with something approaching warmth. An older woman named Clara, who brought soup when Serafina was unwell, and never looked at the collar at all, as if she had decided it simply was not the interesting thing about her. A younger girl named Nora, who was too small and too fast, and too in love with the world to slow down long enough to feel awkward around Serafina, and who talked to her with an easy chatter that asked nothing specific in return. These people were not close to her in the way that people are close to someone they fully know, but they were present, and presence, Serafina was learning, was its own particular kind of gift. What she did not have was anyone who understood what it was like to feel something large and real moving inside her that she was not allowed to release. The wolf that pressed against the collar's wall and was pressed back, again and again, never weakened by the pressing, only compressed further, building the kind of density that produced heat. At 15, Serafina found her way into Crest's private study, on a night when he was away at a border meeting. She had been planning this for months, waiting for the right combination of his absence and the guard's inattention. She went looking for something specific. She found more than she was looking for. In the study's back shelf, behind the official pack documents that anyone might access, were the older records. The original founding agreements, the bloodline treaties, the council resolutions going back 4 generations. She pulled the relevant ones and read them in the dark with a small candle, reading quickly and carefully, and keeping each sentence in the archive. She found the original Blackthorn contract, her name, spelled out in formal pack language, with Crest's signature, and the council seal below it. The terms were exactly as she had been told, with one additional clause she had not known about. A clause that said the contract would remain valid and enforceable regardless of the willingness of either party involved, and would supersede any objection raised by the bound individual, because the contract was a matter of pack security, rather than personal preference. Regardless of the willingness of either party involved. She read it twice to make sure she had understood it correctly. Then she replaced it exactly as she had found it, and left the study, and sat in the hallway outside for a few minutes with the small candle in her hand, and the specific cold feeling that comes from seeing something clearly that you had hoped you were wrong about. She was not wrong. She had hoped the contract had a weakness. It did not have the weakness she had hoped for. What it had, instead, was absolute language, the language of men who had been extremely careful to close every possible exit before sealing the door. She went back to her room and lay in the dark and thought for a long time. Then she got up and took out the small notebook she kept hidden under the stone in the far corner of her floor, and she wrote 3 words. Then she closed the notebook and replaced it and went to sleep. The 3 words were, "Find another way." By 16, she had stopped flinching when people looked at the collar. She had noticed, somewhere in her 15th year, that flinching was communicating something she did not want to communicate. It said the collar was working as intended. It said it had found a purchase in her that went deeper than the skin. She decided it had not. She decided to carry herself the way she intended to eventually exist, which was without the collar, without the weight of it, without the reflex of apology. The change was not dramatic. She did not announce it. She simply stopped, day by day, allowing the collar to determine how she held her shoulders, or where she directed her eyes when someone stared. She met the stares directly. She held her posture like someone who had decided what she was, and the collar at her throat was a fact of the present, not a declaration of the permanent. People noticed, not always in ways they could have named, but the drift toward the far side of the meadow happened less. At 17, she asked her mother to teach her everything she knew about medicinal plants and wound treatment. Mira had been waiting for this, and she began immediately. They worked together in the evenings for months, in the kitchen or the small garden at the back of the house, Mira showing her which plants did what and how the preparations were made, and Serafina absorbing all of it with the same focused attention she brought to everything she decided mattered. At 18, she began assembling the practical framework of what she had already privately decided to do. She knew she would not be in this pack when the Blackthorn heir came to claim her. She had known this for years, at some level. What had changed was that she had moved from knowing it abstractly to planning it concretely. She needed money, stored carefully over time from small earnings. She needed knowledge of the paths out of the Northern Territory and through the neutral lands beyond. She needed to understand what a person needed to survive alone, outside the structure of a pack, in the parts of the world where pack rules did not fully apply. She was also, by 18, aware of something else, something she had been noticing for the past year and had not yet found a way to name properly. A sensation, faint and intermittent, like a thread tugging at the center of her chest, from some direction she could not identify. It was not the collar. She knew the collar's sensations well enough to distinguish them. This was something else entirely, something that originated in her wolf, rather than at her throat, and it pulled in a direction that felt distant and almost theoretical. She chose, at 18, to set that sensation aside and focus on what she could control. She was practical in that way. There were enough problems with clear solutions in front of her. She could not afford to spend energy on things she could not yet see clearly. Her mother knew, by this point, that Serafina was planning to leave. They did not discuss it in explicit terms. They did not need to. They had always communicated in the space between words, in the things said by the directions of attention, and the questions asked and not asked. Mira began teaching her additional things. How to move through a forest in a way that minimized the trail you left. How to disguise your scent using specific plant combinations that she tested and refined and wrote down for Serafina on a folded piece of paper that Serafina placed inside her left boot, which was the same boot Mira had always used for important papers. There was one conversation they had directly, once, in the last autumn, before Serafina turned 20. They were in the kitchen, which was where they had most of their real conversations, because the kitchen was the only room in the house where Mira's presence was always expected, and never particularly interesting to anyone else. Mira said, "When you go, go completely. Do not write. Do not send word. Anything that can be traced will be traced." Serafina looked at her. "I know. I know you know," Mira said. "I am saying it anyway." She paused. She looked at the collar at her daughter's throat for a moment. "The thing Ada said, when you were small. Do you remember it?" "Yes," Serafina said. She remembered it exactly. She had never stopped remembering it. Mira nodded. "Hold on to it. On the days when it is hard, hold on to it." They did not hug. They were not, as a general rule, a household that communicated through physical warmth, because Crest's presence in the house over the years had gradually made warmth something that happened carefully and in private. But Mira put her hand on Serafina's face for a moment, briefly, with a fullness of intent that communicated everything a hug could have communicated. Then she went back to what she had been doing. And Serafina went back to her room and opened her notebook and added to the list of things she had been planning. And she thought about Ada's words, and she thought about the thread pull in her chest that came and went, and she thought about the man she had never met, who was already expecting her to appear at his door and be what he had been told she would be. She thought about all of it, and then she went to sleep, because she had learned that sleep was necessary, and that worrying through the night did not improve the planning in any meaningful way. 2 years from now, Dorian Blackthorn would arrive in the northern mountains to formally collect what he believed was already his. He would discover, very quickly, that his information had been incomplete. Word arrived on a Monday. 3 riders from the south, wearing the Blackthorn clan's colors of deep gray and silver, had been seen on the mountain road. They carried a formal notice wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with a signet ring. Dorian Blackthorne, heir to the Blackthorne territories, would be arriving in 5 days to begin the formal proceedings for the mating contract sealed 20 years prior. Serafina read the copied notice that one of the household servants left on the kitchen table, apparently without thinking about who else might see it. She read it once. Then she folded it and left the kitchen and went upstairs to her room and stood at the window for a few minutes, looking at the mountain road in the distance. 5 days. She had planned for this. She had been planning for this for 2 years with increasing specificity, and for longer than that in general terms. She had money hidden in a waterproof cloth under the stone in her floor, enough for 2 to 3 months of careful living. She had scent-masking herbs dried and stored in small pouches. She had a route planned through the neutral territory to the southeast, which was the direction least watched because it led away from both the Blackthorne lands and the main pack hunting grounds. She had 3 sets of clothing that could pass for someone who did not belong to a mountain pack. She was ready. What she had not fully prepared for was the 5 days of watching the house transform around her in ways that made her skin crawl. The household staff cleaned rooms that had not been cleaned in years. Crest held 2 separate meetings with the elders about the formal proceedings. Food orders were sent to the lower village for supplies that would be required for the formal welcome dinner. There were flowers cut and arranged in the main hall. There were linens laundered and aired. The entire machine of the household, which Serafina had spent 20 years observing, turned itself toward the arrival of Dorian Blackthorne with a smooth efficiency that said this had been anticipated for a long time. No one asked Serafina anything. No one told her what to expect or what would be required of her, or what the proceedings would involve. She existed, during those 5 days, as the subject of preparations she had no part in, the way a room exists in the preparations for its rearrangement. She used the 5 days to finish what she needed to finish. She made a final check of her supplies. She identified a specific night, the night after Dorian's arrival, when the guard rotation would have a gap of approximately 40 minutes between the change, a gap she had tracked for 6 weeks and had confirmed with careful observation. She packed what she was taking into a bag that could be worn flat against her back under a coat. On the 5th morning, she went to find her mother. Mira was in the garden. She was trimming the plants that lined the south wall, her back to the house, her hands moving steadily. She did not turn around when she heard Serafina come through the gate. She said, very quietly, "Tonight?" "Tomorrow night," Serafina said, "after he arrives. If I go tonight, they will know before he comes, and the whole mountain will be watched." Mira nodded slowly, her hands still moving. "After the formal meeting tomorrow, while they are still adjusting to his presence, the attention will be on him." "Yes." A pause. The garden was warm and quiet. A bird was making a noise in the tree near the wall. "You have everything you need," Mira said. It was not a question. "Yes." Mira finally put down her clippers and turned around. She looked at her daughter the way she had always looked at her, with a clear, complete attention that held nothing back and asked for nothing in return. She looked at the collar one more time, then at Serafina's face. "He will not find you," she said, "because you will not stay anywhere long enough to be findable, and because you are better at disappearing than they are at looking. I made sure of that." "I know," Serafina said. They were quiet together for a moment in the warm garden. Then Mira picked up her clippers and went back to the plants, because standing in doorways too long was how things were noticed, and neither of them could afford to be noticed right now. Dorian Blackthorne arrived the following afternoon, with 12 riders and 2 carriages, and a manner that established, within the first 5 minutes of his appearance in the main courtyard, exactly what kind of man he was. He was 32 years old, tall, well-built, with a face that would have been called handsome by people who preferred faces that showed no uncertainty whatsoever. He wore his wealth and his family's power, the way Crest wore authority, comfortably, and without appearing to notice it. He greeted the pack elders with an efficiency that said he was a man who was used to formalities and understood their function, and was not particularly interested in their texture. He looked at the house. He looked at the courtyard. He looked at Crest with the even, measuring look of a business partner assessing whether the investment will prove adequate. He did not look for Serafina right away. He did not appear to feel any particular urgency about that. He was the kind of man who was sure enough of his position that he could afford not to rush. Serafina watched from the upper window of the East Hall. standing just back from the frame so that she was in shadow. She watched Dorian Blackthorne climb down from his horse and greet the pack elders, and look at her father's house with the casual ownership of a man who has arrived to collect something that has been paid for. She watched him for 3 minutes. She learned, in those 3 minutes, a great deal. The formal introduction happened at the dinner. Serafina had been told to attend, which she did, in the correct dress, with her hair arranged properly, wearing the kind of expression that communicated nothing. She sat at the table and ate what was served, and spoke when spoken to, with answers that were polite and complete, and revealed nothing she had not decided to reveal. Dorian sat across from her and to the left. He looked at her twice during the meal. The first look was assessing. The second was satisfied, in the way someone looks satisfied when an expectation has been met, rather than exceeded, but at least has been met. He spoke to Crest about the trade agreements and the border arrangements and the formal schedule for the proceedings. He did not address Serafina directly during the meal. At the end of the dinner, when the formal portion was concluding, he finally turned to her. He said, "I am told you have been well prepared." Serafina looked at him. "I have been prepared for many things," she said, which was true, in ways he did not have the context to understand. He seemed to find this adequately pleasant. He nodded once and returned his attention to Crest. That night, the house settled into its routines. The riders were housed in the lower quarters. The elders retired to their respective buildings. Crest stayed up late with Dorian and 2 of the senior Blackthorne advisors, discussing the formal schedule in the study. Serafina went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and thought about everything she had observed that day, turning it over carefully, looking at it from several angles. Then she lay down fully dressed, with her bag already positioned under the bed, and she let her eyes close but not her mind, which stayed alert and tracking the sounds of the house as it moved towards sleep. She was waiting for midnight. What came for her instead, at 11:45, was something she had not predicted. A guard named Silas, who was one of Dorian's men and not a pack member, knocked on her door and told her, very politely, that she was required to move to the formal guest wing for the night, per Dorian's instructions, so that the formal proceedings could begin properly in the morning. He said it politely. He stood at the door politely. He was, in every visible way, a man simply following instructions. She understood immediately what was happening. Moving her to the guest wing put her under Dorian's household's direct supervision for the night. It moved her out of the room where her bag was. It moved her away from the window she had planned to leave through. It put her in a wing of the house she had not included in her route. She said, "Of course," and picked up one thing from the room, a small traveling coat, under which she could hook the strap of the bag that she had already slipped over her shoulder in the half-second, while Silas was looking at the doorframe. The guest wing room was clean and cold, with one window, and a lock on the door that was meant to keep people out rather than in, which meant it was not a very good lock for the purpose they were now inadvertently using it for. Serafina sat in the room for 1 hour after Silas closed the door. She sat completely still. She let the house go quiet around her. She felt the collar at her throat, familiar and constant, and she felt underneath it the heat of her wolf, which had been building over the past weeks, in a way she had been carefully managing, but which had not gone away. It never went away. It had simply been waiting, the way pressure waits, the way everything compressed waits, for the moment when the compression finally exceeds what the container can hold. She thought about Mira's face in the garden. She thought about Ada's words, said to an infant, who could not yet understand them, but whose bones had absorbed them like water absorbs into stone over time. They collared you, because they saw what you would become. She thought about Dorian Blackthorne's face across the dinner table, the assessing look, the satisfied look, the complete and comfortable assumption that she had been waiting here for 20 years to be collected. The wolf surged. It came from somewhere deep and central, a wave of heat that rose through her body from the ground up, and the collar responded immediately. It tightened. The humming began, louder than she had ever felt it, pressing against the skin of her throat, pressing against the runes, pressing against the wall it had spent 20 years maintaining. Serafina pressed back. She had never done this before. She had always, by training and by instinct and by the calculated patience of someone who understood timing, managed the surge before it reached this level. She had always brought herself back from the edge rather than going over it. Tonight, she went over it. She felt her wolf push against the wall with everything it had. She felt the collar respond with everything it was designed to respond with. She felt the runes along the silver heat up against her skin, not burning but intensely present, the way something feels when it is working at the extreme limit of its design. She opened her mouth. What she did next was something she had thought about, theoretically, exactly once, almost 2 years ago, in the middle of a night, when the archive had been working through everything she had learned about the collar, turning it over and over looking for something she might have missed. She had thought, the collar is metal. Metal has a structural limit. And she had thought, the runes are pressed into the surface of the metal. They do not go all the way through. And she had thought, moon silver is resistant to external tools. It is not rated against something that is, for a wolf of a certain bloodline strength, essentially internal. She bit down. The pain was immediate and exact. Her jaw was not fully shifted. She could not fully shift. That was the whole point of the collar. But it was shifted enough that her bite had a force it did not normally carry, and she brought that force down on the thinnest section of the collar's circumference with a precision that was the product of 2 years of thinking about exactly where to aim. The first bite cracked 2 of the runes. She felt it like a sound inside her bones rather than in her ears. A splitting sound, high and metallic, and then a rush of something through her blood that had nowhere to go and everywhere to go simultaneously. Her wolf flooding into the suddenly wider space, and the collar fighting it, the remaining runes fighting it, the suppression that had been maintained for 20 years pushing back with everything it still had. She bit again. This time it was worse. The pain went from exact to overwhelming, a heat that spread from her jaw outward, through her skull and down her spine, and the collar's humming became something closer to a shriek, audible now, not just felt. She clenched every muscle in her body, and kept her jaw locked. Something cracked deeper. She felt the wall that had been in her chest her entire life buckle. Not break completely. Not yet. But buckle. Warp. A structural give that meant it was going to break. She bit a 3rd time. She tasted her own blood, warm and metallic. The collar was cutting into her throat where her jaw had altered its shape, but she did not stop, because she understood, in the particular clarity that extreme situations sometimes produce, that there was no version of stopping that she wanted to exist in. There was only through. 4th bite. The collar broke. It did not fall apart cleanly. It fractured in a way that meant a section of it remained hooked against itself, and she had to pull, hard, with her hands, breathing through the pain and the blood, and the rush of something enormous pouring through her bloodstream, like a dam releasing. The runes went dark. She could feel them going dark one by one as the structure failed, feel each little suppression lifting, feel the wall in her chest collapse fully, feel her wolf unfurl into a space it had never been allowed to occupy, and the feeling was enormous and overwhelming, and completely worth everything that had just happened to get there. She looked at the broken pieces of the collar in her hands. Her throat was bleeding. Not badly, but enough. She pressed the inside of her coat sleeve against it for 90 seconds, and breathed steadily until it slowed. She heard voices in the hallway. The shriek of the collar had been audible. She had perhaps 3 minutes. She went to the window. The lock was simple. She was through it in 12 seconds. The drop to the garden below was about 15 feet. She went over the sill and dropped and landed, and was moving before her body had fully processed the landing, crossing the garden at a run, heading for the gap in the eastern wall that she had found, 8 months ago, while doing something that could pass for an innocent evening walk. She went through the gap. The forest was ahead of her, dark and cold and full of the sounds of wind in the old trees. She ran into it without looking back. Behind her, in the room she had just left, the broken collar lay on the guest wing floor. The runes were cold and dead. The metal was in 3 pieces. Dorian Blackthorne, woken by the sound of it and by the sudden absence of the bond suppression he had been feeling as a low background signal for 20 years, came to the doorway of the room and looked at what was on the floor and stood there for a long moment. Then he said one word, very quietly, to Silas, who was standing behind him. "Find her." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who fully expected to be obeyed. He had been saying things with that certainty his entire life, and people had always obeyed. But Serafina was already in the forest, running hard, and the night was very dark, and the trees were old and thick, and she knew, because her mother had taught her, how to run through a forest without leaving the kind of trail that experienced hunters could follow. She ran until the mountain house was completely gone from sight and sound, and then she ran further still, because further was the only direction she was interested in. The first night of true freedom felt nothing like she had imagined it would. She had imagined it, in the years of planning, as something that would feel large and clean, like stepping out of a room that had been too small into open air. What it actually felt like was cold and complicated, and terrifying, in a way that had nothing to do with the sounds the forest made around her. The terror was internal. She was alone for the first time in her life, with no structure around her, no walls she knew the dimensions of, no routines she had memorized. She was also bleeding lightly from her throat, running through dark trees on a mountain she knew only partially, with people behind her who knew this territory far better than she did. She ran for 4 hours before she allowed herself to slow. By then, she was across the first ridge and into the lower territory that edged toward the neutral lands, and the sounds behind her were too distant and too infrequent to indicate organized tracking. She found a space between two large roots where the ground was dry, and she sat down against the trunk and pressed her sleeve against her throat again and breathed. The wolf was extraordinary. She had felt it before, always through the filter of the collar's suppression, always as something compressed and managing. Now it was simply present, filling her completely, like a fire burning at its proper height, instead of being held low under a lid. It did not feel frightening. It felt like herself. It felt, in fact, like the part of herself she had been prevented from fully meeting for 20 years, and the introduction was something she sat with quietly for several minutes in the dark between the roots. Then she stood up and oriented herself by the stars, which her mother had taught her to read on clear nights over the course of several patient years, and she chose a direction and she started walking. She walked for 3 days before she crossed out of the Northern Territory entirely. During those 3 days, she ate the dried food she had packed and drank from streams and stayed off the main paths. She kept the scent-masking herbs applied regularly, mixing them the way Mira had shown her, and she moved carefully in a way that left as little physical trace as possible. She did not sleep in any place for more than a few hours at a time. She moved mostly at night and rested in the most concealed spots she could find during the brightest hours of the day. She checked her throat in a stream reflection on the second morning. The bleeding had stopped. The wounds were shallow and were already healing with the speed that came naturally to wolves. What remained were thin marks along the skin, where the collar had pressed, and where her bite had broken through, and she looked at them in the water, with a clarity that had no drama in it. They were there. They would fade somewhat, but likely not entirely. She accepted this, and moved on. She crossed into the neutral territory on the third evening, at a point where the tree cover was thick, and the border markers were old enough to be partly hidden by the forest's growth. She stood on the other side for a moment, and let herself feel what the crossing meant. Then she kept walking. The first identity came to her in the third week. She was in a small trading town called Hartwell, in the southern neutral zone, where pack law did not fully apply, and where people moved through on their way to larger places, and were not closely questioned. She rented a room for 2 nights from an older woman who ran a boarding house, and who asked her name at the door. Serafina looked at her and said, "Sarah Wynne." The name had been ready in her mind for months, chosen because it sounded ordinary, and because it shared enough phonetics with her real name, that she could respond to it without hesitation. "Sarah Wynne," the woman repeated, and wrote it in her ledger, and gave her a key. Sarah Wynne was 3 years old for the next 6 months, while Serafina learned what she needed to learn about existing outside a pack structure. She learned which towns asked questions and which ones did not. She learned how to present herself as a traveler without appearing to be running from anything, which required a particular kind of ease in the body and eyes that took practice. She learned that in the neutral territories, skills were currency, in a way that money was not always sufficient to replace. She moved through the neutral zone for the first 2 years, never staying anywhere longer than 3 months. She applied for work where it existed, and left when things started feeling too familiar, too known, which was the feeling she associated with danger. The towns she passed through became a list in her memory: Hartwell, Arran, Casford, the river market town of Bray, a small coastal settlement called Dunmere, where the salt air was so strong you could taste it the moment you stepped off the main road. In Bray, she found work with a traveling healer named Dara, who moved between 3 small villages on a seasonal circuit. Dara was a practical, sharp woman in her 50s, who asked Sarah almost no personal questions, and expected precise work in return for her payment, which was exactly the kind of arrangement Sarah needed. She spent 5 months with Dara, learning applied medicine in a way that was more extensive than the theory she had studied from her mother, working with actual cases, actual people, actual problems that required judgment and not just knowledge. When Dara's circuit returned to Bray for the 3rd time, Sarah stayed and Dara continued on, and they parted with the efficient mutual respect of 2 people who had gotten exactly what they needed from an arrangement and were content to end it cleanly. In the winter of her 3rd year out of the northern mountains, she spent 4 months in Casford as a translator for a trade consortium that needed someone who could handle both the Pack dialect that was used in the eastern border territories and the standard neutral zone common tongue. She was good at this in a way she had not expected to be, discovering that the years of careful listening in a household where you were not fully included in any conversation had given her an ear for linguistic patterns that was sharper than most people's. She was Sarah Wynne in Casford. She was Sarah Wynne in Dunmere. She was Sarah Wynne in the 2 years after that, when she worked as a guide and tracker for a nomadic family group that spent each year moving between 7 different seasonal camps across the central neutral zone. She was excellent at being Sarah Wynne. She was easy with people, without being close to them. She was competent and reliable, and slightly mysterious in the way that people who do not talk much about themselves are mysterious. And in most of the places she passed through, the slightly mysterious and reliable person who asked no unnecessary questions and did clean work was welcome. But Sarah Wynne did not sleep through every night. Sarah Wynne woke sometimes at 3 in the morning, with her hand raised toward her throat, reaching for a weight that was not there, still sleeping enough to have forgotten for a moment that it was gone. The moment of reaching was followed always by a moment of remembered absence, and then by the full return of wakefulness, and she would lie in whatever room she was in at the time, and look at the ceiling, and breathe steadily, until her body accepted that the absence was the right state of things. Sarah Wynne also felt, intermittently, the thread pull in her chest that she had first noticed at 17. Without the collar's suppression, it was clearer now, more consistent. She could feel it like a compass needle, a directional pressure from somewhere she could not pinpoint, from something she could not name. It did not intensify over the years, it simply persisted, steady and patient, as if it were willing to wait as long as waiting was what was required. She ignored it. She had enough to manage. The thread could wait. She arrived in Ashvale in the 7th year. Ashvale was a neutral territory border town of moderate size, positioned at the junction of 3 trade roads, which made it busy enough that new arrivals were not unusual, and established enough that it had the kind of services and infrastructure that a person could build a stable life around. It had a small but good apothecary. It had a clinic that was chronically understaffed. It had a market district that ran 3 days out of 7, and a residential district behind the main road, where the houses were small and the neighbors were, for the most part, people who were minding their own concerns. She had not intended to stay in Ashvale. She had intended to pass through it, as she passed through everywhere, taking what she needed and moving, before she became too known. She stayed for 3 years, and then she stayed a 4th, and by the time she stopped counting years, she had a room above the market district, a regular arrangement with the clinic, where she provided herbal remedies and occasionally wound care, a small network of people whose names she knew, and who knew her name, and the particular feeling of a person who has been moving for long enough that the absence of movement becomes its own kind of disorientation. She was careful. She kept the scent-masking herbs in regular use. She did not shift, though she could have, because shifting left traces, and she had learned that the neutral territories were not as free of pack attention as they appeared. She did not discuss where she was from with anyone who pushed past the standard answer, which was the Central Plains, a region large enough that it was nearly impossible to verify. She kept the 3 pieces of the broken collar in a locked box under her bed. She had kept them for reasons she had not fully examined. There was something in her that refused to throw them away, not out of sentiment, but out of something more practical. They were evidence. She did not yet know what she would need to evidence, or when, but she kept them the way a careful person keeps documentation of things that were done to them against their will. The scars at her throat had faded to thin silver lines that were visible if you looked closely, and invisible if you did not. She stopped covering them in her 4th year in Ashvale. She wore them like Mira had worn the particular look in her eyes that said she knew more than she was going to tell you, openly and without apology. Sometimes, lying awake in her room above the market district, she felt the thread in her chest pulling at something, from somewhere in a direction she still could not name. It was constant enough now that she had categorized it alongside the other permanent features of her life, like the scar lines and the monthly check of the scent herbs and the particular way she positioned herself in any room she entered so that she could see both the door and the window at the same time. She did not know what it was pulling toward. She knew what she was doing in Ashevale, which was building something. Not a life that could be traced back to Serafina Voss of the Ironblood Pack. A life that belonged to Sarah Wynne of the Central Plains. A capable woman who helped people and moved quietly through her days and was not owned by anyone. She was 30 years old. She had been free for 10 years. What she did not know was that in a great stone keep 3 territories to the northeast, a man who had not slept through a full night in the same 10 years had just received a report from his best tracker that was specific enough and precise enough that he had looked at it for a very long time and then made a decision that was going to change the shape of both their lives. She had been in Ashevale for 4 years when the case of young Wren arrived at the clinic. Wren was 6 years old and the daughter of a fabric merchant who had his stall in the 3rd row of the market. She was the kind of child who was always running somewhere at a pace her legs had not yet fully caught up with, and the wrist she had broken falling from the market cart was a clean fracture that needed proper setting and a few weeks of careful immobilization. The clinic's main healer was away for the week. Sarah handled the setting herself, talking to the child all the way through it, in a low, steady voice, about the small orange cat she had seen on the main road that morning, describing the cat in such unnecessary and specific detail that Wren stopped being afraid of what was happening to her wrist and became absorbed in the story of the cat instead. By the time Sarah finished wrapping the wrist, Wren was asking whether the cat had a name and whether it lived near the market. "I believe its name is Garnet," Sarah said, which was not true, but was a good name for a small orange cat, and Wren accepted it completely. Nora, who ran the supply side of the clinic's herb stock and who had become, over the 4 years, the closest thing to a friend that Sarah allowed herself in Ashevale, handed Wren a piece of dried fruit from the jar on the counter and told her she was very brave. Wren agreed with this assessment and went back to asking about Garnet. It was a Tuesday. It was an ordinary afternoon. Sarah had wrapped 3 other injuries that morning and was expecting nothing unusual for the rest of the day. That was when the door opened, and a man she had never seen before walked in. She did not turn around right away. She was finishing a note in the patient record. She finished the sentence she was writing before she looked up. When she looked up, the room felt different. She could not have explained exactly how. It was a change in the air, the way a room changes when a window has been opened and the pressure adjusts slightly. It was subtle and immediate, and she felt it in her chest before she processed it with any conscious part of her mind. She turned, fully, to look at who had come in. The man was standing just inside the doorway. He was tall, with the particular build of someone who moved through the world in a way that suggested significant physical capability, kept deliberately quiet. He was looking at her, not at the clinic, not at Wren or Nora. At her. The thread in her chest, the one she had been ignoring for 10 years, went from its usual subtle pull to something that felt like it was trying to get her full attention by any means available. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she looked back down at the patient record and continued writing as if nothing had happened, because the only way to function in a moment like this was to act as if she still had control of the situation, which she intended to maintain for as long as possible. She finished the note. She addressed Wren's father, who had been standing anxiously near the door. She told him the specific care instructions for the wrist. She answered his 2 questions about the recovery timeline, with the precision that came from having done this kind of work for years. She was aware, the entire time, of the man near the door. He had not moved. He had not announced a reason for being in the clinic. He was simply present, with the stillness of someone who had very good reasons to be patient. She showed Wren and her father out. She closed the door. She turned. The man was looking at her. He had, apparently, not stopped looking at her since he walked in. In someone else this might have felt threatening. It did not feel threatening. It felt like something she did not have a clean word for, something that existed between recognition and warning, something that her body responded to with a complicated alertness that was not fear, but was adjacent to several things. "There is a drawer," she said. and I am going to close it now." She opened the supply drawer behind the counter, deliberately and clearly. "When this drawer is closed, I expect you to not be an Ashvale anymore." She began closing the drawer slowly. He said, "My name is Calum." "I did not ask," she said, and closed the drawer, and looked at him directly. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "This clinic closes in 15 minutes. I suggest you find somewhere to be that is not here." She turned and went into the back room, and did not come back out until she heard the door open and close. Nora appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, with her arms folded, and her expression occupying the particular space between concern and curiosity that was Nora's usual state when something unusual had just happened. "Who was that?" she said. "A man who needed directions," Sarah said. Nora looked at her for a long moment, with the look of someone who is fully aware that she is being told something that is technically not a lie, but is also not the thing being asked. Then she nodded and went back to the herb stock. Sarah stood in the back room for 3 minutes. She looked at her hands. They were steady because she had trained them to be steady. But underneath the steadiness, her chest was doing something she had not felt it do in 10 years of careful, managed living. The thread had gone from a pull to a fact. Calum Arden had not slept through a full night in 10 years. His household knew this, his beta knew this, his generals and his senior advisors, and the senior household staff who worked the night rotations knew this, because they had all, at various points in the past decade, encountered him in the pre-dawn hours, standing at the long windows that looked east from the upper level of the keep, sitting at his desk with reports that had already been read, walking the outer walls in the cold with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the dark. They said different things among themselves about why this was. Some of them said it was the weight of ruling 5 territories, which was significant and true, and was absolutely not the reason. Some of them said it was the old grief, the one about the mate bond that the royal bloodline supposedly carried, and how Calum's had been awakened and then immediately gone, which they narrated as a kind of death and mourned on his behalf in ways he found both touching and slightly inaccurate. It was not death, he was absolutely certain of that. Ren was the only person in the keep who knew the specific truth, because Ren was Calum's beta, and had been his closest person since they were 15 years old, and there was simply no hiding a thing like this from someone who had known you that long, and who had the particular observational precision that came with a beta's instinct. The bond went active 10 years ago, Ren had said, on a morning roughly a year after it had happened, when the subject had finally reached the point where it had to be spoken about directly. It went active, and then it moved. It is still moving. That is what you have been tracking. The tracking is not going well, Calum said. No, Ren agreed. It is not. The night it had happened was one he could describe with absolute precision. He had been 28. He had been in a meeting with 3 of his council members, a routine evening meeting about the spring trade schedules, which was the kind of meeting he usually found dull but manageable. He had been sitting at the long table with his hands around a cup of tea, listening to one of the council members explain something about tariff structures. And then everything changed. It was not subtle. It was not a gradual awareness or a growing feeling. It was immediate and total, a bond ignition that hit him like a change in gravity, like suddenly being oriented in a direction he had not known existed before, and understanding that this was the correct direction, and that everything before this moment had been lived slightly sideways from where he was supposed to be. He had set down his tea carefully and said, "Give me a moment," to the council members, and walked out of the room, because the alternative was to have a deeply undignified response to a mate bond in front of 3 people who were trying to discuss tariffs. He had stood in the hallway. The bond had pulled at him, warm and enormous and overwhelming, filling the space in his chest that he had not fully understood was empty, until it was suddenly no longer empty. And then, within minutes, it had moved. Not disappeared, not faded, moved. Like a thread being pulled from one side, the source of the pull putting distance between them, at a speed that said something had changed, something had happened, something had set the person on the other end of this bond into motion in a specific direction. Away from him. He had stood in the hallway for a long time after that, feeling the bond adjust to the increasing distance, becoming thinner and harder to pinpoint, but never going out, the way a fire becomes harder to see when you move away from it, but does not stop burning on account of the distance. He had gone back to the meeting. He had sat down. He had discussed tariffs for another hour, with a focus that he was extremely proud of in retrospect. Then he had gone to find Ren. The searching had started quietly. He had asked Felix, his best tracker, to begin noting any reports from the northern or neutral territories of unusual wolf activity, or unattached wolves, who appeared and disappeared from settled areas. Felix was thorough and discreet, and understood that he was being asked to find something, and not to discuss what he was looking for, with anyone outside the beta's immediate circle. The early years had produced almost nothing. Occasional fragments. A report of a dark-haired woman with silver eyes at a trading post in the neutral zone, who had left before anyone thought to ask questions. A rumor of a healer in one of the river towns who was skilled beyond what her apparent experience should have allowed. Ghost traces, whispers of presence without the presence itself. The bond remained, constant and distant and alive. Ren had raised the subject 3 times over the years with a directness that Calum respected, even when he found it inconvenient. The council is asking again, Ren had said, in the 6th year, about a formal mating arrangement. Leon has been particularly persistent about the succession implications. The council can continue asking, Calum said. I told them as much, in more diplomatic terms, but the question is not going away. Ren paused. Calum, 10 years is a long time to follow a thread that has no confirmed end. It has an end, Calum said. I can feel it. Feeling it and reaching it are different things. I know that. He looked at Ren. If you are asking me whether I am going to stop, the answer is no. If you are asking because you are genuinely concerned, I appreciate the concern. If you are asking because Leon asked you to, tell Leon I appreciate his concern as well, and will continue not acting on it. Ren was quiet for a moment. She has been running for 10 years. Yes. Which means she has a reason to run. Yes. And that reason might include not being found. Calum was quiet. He looked at the window. Outside, the night was clear and cold, and the stars were visible all the way to the horizon. If she doesn't want to be found, she can tell me that when I find her, and then I will leave. But she deserves the chance to say it herself, rather than having me assume it on her behalf. Ren looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, in the way he nodded when he had heard something that he was not certain he agreed with, but was willing to let stand for now. The pressure from the council had become more pointed in the 9th year, when a formal petition was circulated among the 5 territory Alpha representatives suggesting that the Alpha King's continued lack of a formal mating arrangement was creating instability in the succession structure. Leon, who had raised the issue more times than anyone else, and who had the persistence of a man who genuinely believed he was acting in the interests of the Pack Alliance, had brought the petition to Calum personally. Calum had read it. He had thanked Leon. He had filed it in a drawer, and had not looked at it again. It was in the 10th year that Felix's report changed. Felix returned from a 3-month circuit through the neutral territories, which had been his 4th such circuit in the past 6 years, and he came to Calum directly, with a report that was unlike any he had brought before. He set it on the desk and said, I think I found a credible lead. Calum looked at the report. It was specific in ways the previous reports had not been. A town called Ashvale, at the junction of 3 trade roads in the southern neutral territory. A woman known locally as Sarah Wynne, who had been in residence for 4 years, which was far longer than anyone with something to hide would normally stay, who worked at the clinic, who was described by multiple sources as calm, capable, and slightly private, in a way that did not attract suspicion, because it was consistent and ordinary seeming. Whose scent, on one occasion when Felix had been standing downwind of her on the market road, had carried beneath its herbal masking the specific trace of something that Felix had spent 10 years learning to recognize. Moon silver. Old, settled, long-worn. The kind of trace a metal leaves on skin it has been in contact with for a very long time. Calum read the report twice, then he set it on the desk. How confident are you? He said. Felix said, confident enough that I came straight back. Calum was quiet for a moment. He felt the bond, as he always felt it, a thread pulling in the direction he had been trying to reach for 10 years. He let himself orient to it with his full attention, which he normally kept partially turned away, to avoid the particular frustration of feeling something you could not yet reach. He oriented to it and held there. It pulled south, slightly east of south. Ashvale was southeast. He told Wren that evening. Wren listened, without interrupting. When Calum finished, Wren said, "You are going yourself?" "Yes." "I assumed as much," Wren considered. "Alone, or with Felix?" "Felix will come as far as the nearest settled point, and wait there. I go into Ashvale alone." He paused. "If she has been hiding for 10 years, arriving with an escort is not the way to introduce myself." "No," Wren agreed. "It is not." Calum spent 2 days arranging matters for his absence. He did not tell the council where he was going, only that he would be out of the territory for a period of time on personal business, and that Wren had authority in his absence. Leon asked twice for specifics. Calum told him the personal business was personal, and packed his travel bag. He did not sleep well the night before he left, but that was not unusual. He stood at the east window for a while in the early morning dark, feeling the bond at the regular distance he had learned to live with, and thinking about what he was going to say when he walked through a door in a small clinic in a border town and found the person he had been looking for. He had not planned specific words. He did not think specific words were the first thing that was going to be needed. What he had, instead, was a clear and practical commitment to the most important truth of the situation, which was this: she had been running for 10 years. She had reasons. Those reasons were hers. He was not walking into Ashvale to collect something. He was walking in to finally stand in front of another person who, for reasons she alone could explain, had the other end of a thread he had been holding for a decade. What happened after that was going to be up to her. He rode south at first light with Felix and 2 others, moving fast, covering ground in a way that allowed them to reach the outer edge of the southern neutral territory in 4 days, instead of the usual 7. They stopped at the last settlement before Ashvale, a small inn town called Greenford, and Calum went the remaining distance to Ashvale alone. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. He went to the clinic because the clinic was where Felix's report placed the woman. He walked through the door. The room inside was clean and quiet and smelled of herbs and something metallic and clean. A child was sitting on a low stool with a wrapped wrist, talking happily to a man standing beside her. A woman with brown hair and a quick, competent manner was at the supply shelves near the back wall. And at the counter, bent over a patient record with a pen in her hand, was a woman whose scent, beneath the herbal masking, hit him with the specific weight and warmth of the bond, arriving at its destination after 10 years of searching. He stood inside the door. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was writing. Then she turned around, and their eyes met, and the bond, which had been a distant, persistent presence in his chest since the night of a routine council meeting about tariffs a decade ago, became something so immediate and so present that he understood, in a way that did not require words, that the thread had found its other end. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back at her patient record and continued the appointment as if nothing had happened. He stood inside the door and let her finish, because the last thing he was going to do was interrupt whatever she needed to do to get through the next few minutes. He owed her that much, and considerably more. He had been standing there for approximately 3 minutes when she finally addressed him, and even then, she did not look away from the counter. She told him there was a drawer. She told him she was going to close it, and that when it was closed, she expected him to not be in Ashvale. He said his name. She said she had not asked. The drawer closed. She told him the clinic closed in 15 minutes and suggested he find somewhere else to be. Then she walked into the back room. He stood in the clinic for a moment longer than was necessary, partly because he was processing what had just happened, and partly because he was taking inventory of the specific set of skills she had just demonstrated in the space of roughly 90 seconds, which included maintaining complete composure during a bond ignition, continuing to function at a professional level while doing so, and communicating a very clear preference about his location, while revealing absolutely nothing about whether she knew what was happening between them. She knew. He was certain of that. The bond did not behave the way it had just behaved on only one side of it. She had felt it, and she had responded to it by closing a drawer and walking into the back room. He left the clinic. He walked down the main market road of Ashvale for a while, taking in the town, which was a reasonable-sized neutral territory settlement with the particular quality of neutral zones, that comfortable, slightly anonymous energy of a place where many kinds of people pass through, and not all of them were required to explain themselves. He found a tavern and ate a meal and thought. She was here. She was alive. She was clearly capable, clearly established, and clearly not interested in being approached without a great deal of care and consideration. She had given him one look, and it had lasted less than 2 seconds, and it had contained more information than most people's long conversations. There was a sharpness to her that was not hostile, but was entirely alert. The sharpness of someone who has learned to see situations clearly because their survival has depended on it. He had been a little afraid of what he would feel when he finally found her. Not afraid in a way that would have stopped him, but afraid in the way you are afraid of something enormous, of a thing you have been carrying toward for so long that arriving at it is almost overwhelming. What he had felt, in the moment their eyes met, was something closer to recognition than to any emotion he had a clean word for. Like finding something that had always been yours but that you had never been permitted to hold. He finished his meal. He paid. He went out into the afternoon and found a quiet seat on a bench at the edge of the market district and sat there for a while. He would be in Asheville tonight. He would send a message to Felix that said simply arrived, found her, waiting. He did not know what tomorrow looked like. He knew what he wanted tomorrow to look like, which was a real conversation with a real person who would, if he handled this with any competence at all, have the opportunity to make her own decisions about what happened next. He sat on the bench in the afternoon light of Asheville and breathed steadily and felt the bond for the first time without distance between them. It was the best he had felt in 10 years. She did not go to the forest that night. She went home to her room above the market district, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she was honest with herself, in the way she had learned to be honest with herself over the years, which was completely and without the comforting edits that people normally apply to their own assessments. She knew what a mate bond felt like. She had spent 10 years carrying the suppressed version of one, at a level she had categorized and filed as a persistent, manageable background element. What had happened in the clinic that afternoon was the unsuppressed version of that bond, from an arm's length away, with the person who held the other end of it standing 3 meters from her, and looking at her, with the particular look of someone who had been looking for her for a very long time. She had closed a drawer and walked into the back room, because those were the most sensible actions available to her in that moment, and she was a person who, when confronted with something enormous and potentially life-altering, defaulted immediately to the most sensible action available. It was a trait she had developed out of necessity and had come to value. She had closed the drawer. He had apparently left the clinic. Good. But he was still in Asheville. She knew that. She could feel it. The bond oriented like a compass needle, pointing toward wherever he was in this small town. It was not subtle. It was, in fact, significantly less subtle than anything else she had felt since the collar came off. And she had felt quite a lot of things since the collar came off. She sat on the edge of her bed and considered her options. Option 1 was to leave Asheville tonight, pack the essentials, use the back way out through the river path, be across the southern neutral boundary by morning. Sarah Wynne of Asheville would simply stop existing, the way she had stopped existing in half a dozen places before this one, and something new would start somewhere else. She held this option in her mind and examined it honestly. Then she put it down. 4 years. She had been in Asheville for 4 years. She had the clinic, which she had built into something useful. She had Nora. She had the room above the market, with its specific view and its particular sounds in the morning. She had, for the first time since the night she climbed out of a guest wing window on a northern mountain, something that felt genuinely like a place rather than a waypoint. She was tired of waypoints. She was also, and she acknowledged this clearly, tired of running from a bond she had not chosen but that had, by all observable evidence, done nothing in 10 years except exist patiently and leave her alone. The bond had not come looking for her. The bond had not tracked her and sent soldiers and invoked contracts and demanded anything from her. The bond had simply been there, a direction in her chest that required nothing from her but that also had not, in 10 years of her ignoring it, gone away or diminished. That was, she admitted to herself, a somewhat relevant data point. Option 2 was to go to the forest edge, at the specific spot where the Market District Road met the tree line, at whatever time felt correct, and have a conversation. A real one. With the person who had looked at her in the clinic that afternoon, with the specific look of someone who has been carrying something for a long time, and has finally, at tremendous personal cost, arrived at the place where it might be set down. She sat with this option for a while too. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went to the clinic to check on the herb preparations she had been drying for the past week, because she was not going to make this decision in her room, and she needed something to do with her hands while she made it. Nora was at the clinic, working late, which was unusual. Nora looked up when Sarah came in, looked at her for a moment with the focused attention of someone who has decided to say something, and then said it. "The man who came in today," Nora said. "Did you know him?" "No," Sarah said, which was true in all the technical ways. Nora nodded slowly. "He stayed in Ashevale. I saw him on the market road this evening." She paused. "He has that look." Sarah looked at her. "What look?" "The look," Nora said, with the particular certainty of a woman who had been paying attention to how people looked at each other for a long time. Of someone who has been looking for something for a very long time, and has just found it, and is being extremely careful about what they do next. Sarah turned back to the herbs. "Sarah," Nora said. "I heard you," Sarah said. "That was not an observation designed to be ignored," Nora said. Sarah worked through the herb preparation in silence for a few minutes. Then she said, without turning around, "Is it obvious that I have not come from the Central Plains?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Not obvious," she said, "but I have wondered. For a while." A pause. "I did not ask, because it was not mine to ask." Sarah considered this. "I will tell you everything, at some point, when I am able to." "I am not asking for that either," Nora said. "I am just telling you what I saw on the market road. The rest is yours." Sarah finished the herb preparation. She closed the drying rack. She stood for a moment with her hands on the counter, looking at the wall in front of her. Then she said, "I need some air." The forest edge at the north end of Ashevale was where the market road stopped and the trees began. It was a quiet place at night, not entirely isolated, the lights of the town still visible behind, the sounds of the town still audible, but the particular quality of night air, when trees are close, was present, and the smell of pine and soil was strong enough to make the market district feel further than it was. She arrived at the edge of the trees at a few minutes before midnight, and stood with the forest at her back and the town lights ahead of her, and waited. He was there within 5 minutes. He came from the direction of the tavern, walking without particular hurry, and he stopped at a reasonable distance, about 6 meters, and stood there. He did not come closer. He did not speak first. She looked at him in the dark. He was taller than she had registered in the clinic, or perhaps the low light of the clinic had compressed things. He had the kind of presence that people carry when they are used to rooms orienting toward them, except he was not using it right now, deliberately not using it, which took a particular kind of self-awareness. She said, "You did not leave Ashevale." "No," he said. "I told you to. You told me to not be in Ashevale when the drawer was closed. The drawer is now open." A slight pause, metaphorically. She almost responded to this. She did not. "I asked a question when you came in, and you gave me your name. I am asking the second question now. How did you find me?" He told her, simply and directly. His tracker, 4 years of circuit surveys, the moon silver trace. He was not elaborate about it, and he did not, which she noticed, spend any time making himself sound particularly impressive. He described the process the way you describe something you did that worked, without additional commentary. 10 years, she said, when he finished. "Yes. You spent 10 years looking for a person you had never met, based on a bond that ignited, and then ran in the opposite direction." "Yes," he said. She looked at him in the dark. "And that struck you as a reasonable thing to do." "It struck me as the only thing I was willing to do," he said. There was no particular defensiveness in this. It was simply accurate. She considered this. She said, "My name is Serafina Voss. I was born to the Iron Blood Pack in the northern mountains. I have been in the neutral territory for 10 years, under a different name. You found me. That is a fact I am currently in the process of accepting." She looked at him steadily. "Before this conversation goes anywhere else, I need you to understand something specific." "All right," he said. "I am not going to be collected," she said. "I am not going to be returned to anything, or handed to anyone. I am not property that has been located. I am a person standing at the edge of a forest in a neutral territory, and I have been free for 10 years, and the only reason I am still standing here and not already running, is that I am finished with running, and I am choosing to have this conversation. Do you understand the difference? He looked at her. Yes, he said, I do. Then we can continue, she said. The night was cool, and the forest was dark behind her, and the lights of Ashvale flickered ahead of them, and the bond settled between them, like something that had been held at a distance for so long, that being allowed to simply exist at its natural range was enough, for now, without requiring anything more of it. She said, I am going to tell you something, and then I am going to go home, and you are going to have the night to decide how you feel about it. And tomorrow morning, I am going to be at the clinic, and if you want to continue talking, you can find me there. All right, he said. I was born with a mating collar welded shut around my throat, she said. Before I was an hour old, my father made a contract with the Blackthorn clan when I was still in the womb. The collar suppressed my shift, and tied my future to a man I had never met, and had not agreed to anything with. I wore it for 20 years, and then I bit through it, and I left, and I have been building a life that no one can take from me since that night. She paused. The person the contract bound me to is still out there. He still believes the contract is valid, and you should know that before we have any further conversation, because it is the context for everything else. She stopped. She looked at him. He had been completely still while she spoke, which was the kind of stillness that meant he was listening with everything he had, and not just the part of himself that was waiting for his next turn to speak. He stayed still for a moment after she finished. Then he said, I am sorry. What was done to you was wrong. I do not mean that as a diplomatic response. I mean it because it is true, and because you deserve to hear it said plainly. She had not expected that to be the first thing he said. She noted it, and filed it, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I am going home. The clinic opens at 8. She turned and walked back toward the lights of Ashvale. Behind her, she heard nothing, which meant he was standing where he was and watching her go. She did not look back. She walked all the way home and up the stairs and into her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed again, and she stayed there for a while, in the quiet of the night, with the bond at its natural range for the first time, and she thought about what it felt like to be heard. He came to the clinic the next morning at 8:30. She was already there, working through the morning's preparations, and Nora had not yet arrived. He knocked on the open door before coming in, which she noted, and he came in and sat in the chair near the window that was usually occupied by patients, and he said, Good morning. Good morning, she said. She did not stop what she was doing. I am going to keep working while we talk. That is not a dismissal. It is just how I function in the morning. That's fine, he said. Tell me about the bond, she said. From your side, how it happened and what it has been since then, he told her, directly and without dramatics. A council meeting 10 years ago, the ignition of the bond, and then the immediate movement of the other end of it away from him at speed, the decade of searching, the way the bond had persisted throughout, not loud, not demanding, simply present and alive. He described it with a specificity that told her he had spent a great deal of time thinking about how to describe it accurately. She listened while she worked. When he finished, she said, The night you felt it ignite, what was the date? He gave her the date without hesitation. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, That was the night I broke the collar. He was also quiet for a moment. So the bond had been suppressed for 20 years. The collar was not a mating collar in the traditional sense, she said. It was a suppression mechanism designed to prevent me from shifting and to bind my wolf to a specific person through the force of old runes, rather than through any actual choice on my part. The bond suppression was a secondary effect. When the collar broke, everything that had been held back by it came through at once. Including the bond to me, he said. I did not know what it was at the time, she said. I was in a forest in the dark, in the first hour of my freedom, bleeding from my throat, running from a mountain compound in the middle of the night. I was not in a position to investigate a new sensation in my chest. She paused. I categorized it as something to be addressed later, then later kept moving. 10 years of later, he said. Yes, she turned and looked at him directly, for the first time that morning. I want to be clear about something. What happened last night, and what is happening right now, is not me accepting a bond, or a connection, or anything else, automatically. It is me choosing to have a conversation. Those are two different things. I know, he said. I need you to mean that, she said. Not agree with it as a way to proceed. Actually mean it. He met her eyes. I mean it. You are not something I have found and therefore own. You are a person I have been looking for, which is different. What you decide to do with being found is entirely yours. She held his gaze for a moment, measuring it. He did not look away or qualify what he had said. She turned back to her work. Why did you keep looking? She said. You are the alpha king of 5 territories. You have political advisors who have been making the case for formal mating arrangements for years. Your bond ran away from you on the first night. Most people in your position would have accepted the situation and moved on. I knew it was alive, he said. I could feel that it was alive. Accepting that it was finished would have been a lie, and I do not function well on the basis of lies I have told myself. He paused. Also, I thought about the person on the other end of it. I thought about what it might mean, that they were moving at that speed, and in that direction on that particular night. I thought about someone who had a reason to run that fast, and I thought that person deserved to have someone looking for them. She was quiet for a moment. That is a more considered answer than I expected, she said. I have had 10 years to think it through, he said. She almost smiled. She did not, but it was close. She said, I need to tell you more of it. The full version, not the outline I gave you last night. Because the man from the Blackthorn contract, Dorian, is not someone who accepted that I left. He has people looking for me. They have not found me yet, but they are looking, and now that you have found me, the chances of someone else finding me have increased considerably. She looked at him. That is not a comfortable thing to say to the person who just located me after 10 years, but you should know it. I want to know it, he said. She set down what she was holding and turned fully to face him. She leaned back against the counter. She told him the rest of it, the bloodline reading done before she was born, the agreement between her father and the Blackthorn clan, the specific clause she had found in the contract at 15 that said the binding was enforceable regardless of the willingness of either party. The 20 years of growing up with the collar suppressing her wolf, feeling it push against the walls and be pushed back, Dorian arriving on a Wednesday afternoon, and what she had read in his face in 3 minutes, the night in the guest wing room, what it had taken to break the collar. She did not edit any of it. She did not soften the details or manage how they landed. She told it plainly, the way she had learned to carry her own history, which was without excess drama and without apology. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer expressions of sympathy at the moments when they would have been easiest to offer. He simply stayed present and listened with the full attention of someone who understood that what he was being told was important and who was treating it accordingly. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet in the clinic. Then he said, What do you want to happen? She looked at him. What? With the Blackthorn situation, with all of it. What outcome do you want? No one had asked her that before. Not once in 30 years. Not in any of the conversations she had overheard in the Northern House. Not in the elder meetings whose language she had studied in Crest study. Not in anything that had been said about her or her situation in all the years it had been discussed by people who had not thought to ask her. She said, slowly, I want Dorian Blackthorn to understand, publicly and formally, that the contract has no legal standing, that it cannot be enforced, that whatever old pack law he is planning to invoke, there are older laws and better arguments that undo it. And your father? Calum said. My father made an agreement about a person who could not consent, she said. That has consequences. I want them to be formal ones. Do you have the documentation to support that position? He said. Evidence, testimony, the kind of record that holds up in a formal proceeding. She looked at him for a moment. I have been building that record for 10 years, she said. I did not spend a decade in the neutral territories simply surviving. I spent it gathering. Every border town I passed through in the first 2 years, I looked for people who knew about the collar craftsman and his work. Every year after that, I tracked down other cases like mine. Contracts made about people who were too young or too uninformed to agree to them. I have testimony from 9 individuals. I have copies of 3 other binding contracts that were made without meaningful consent, with the names of the elders and the pack leaders who ratified them. She met his eyes. I have a case. I have had a case for several years. I was waiting for the right moment and the right place to use it. He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully categorize. not surprise. Something more complex than surprise. Something that might have been the specific feeling of hearing someone confirm that they are even more capable than you already understood them to be. "Where are the documents?" he said. "In a secure location that I am not going to tell you the address of yet," she said. "We have known each other for less than 24 hours. Fair," he said. She said, "I have one more question." "All right." "What do you want?" she said. "Not from the situation. From this." She indicated, briefly, the space between them, which was the closest she was going to come to pointing directly at the bond. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who does not know the answer. The quiet of someone deciding how to say the true answer clearly. "I want you to be able to stop running," he said. "I want you to have every outcome you just described, with your name restored, and your record corrected, and that contract declared invalid, by every formal body that exists. I want to be someone you trust enough, over whatever time that takes, to build something with. Not because of the bond. Because you decide to." He paused. "I am aware that is a significant amount to want. I am not asking for it all now. I am telling you what I want, so you have accurate information." She looked at him for a long moment. The clinic was quiet around them. The morning light was coming through the window, at the angle it came through every morning at this time, familiar and ordinary. She said, "I need you to understand that trust is something I build slowly. I do not have a fast version of it. I had a mother who spent years teaching me how to see clearly, and what I see takes time to fully assess." "I know," he said. "I am not asking for fast. I am going to continue living exactly as I have been living," she said. "In this clinic, in Ashevale, under Sarah Wynne, until I decide otherwise." "That is completely fine," he said. "And you are going to tell me who you are," she said. "Everything. Not when I ask. Now. Because if I am going to be making decisions with accurate information, I need accurate information." He told her, his name, his territory, his role as Alpha King of the 5-Territory Alliance, the full extent of what that involved, and what it meant in terms of who he was, and what his life looked like. He told her plainly, without the particular inflation that people in positions of authority sometimes apply to descriptions of themselves. She listened. When he finished, she said, "So the man who spent 10 years looking for me is the Alpha King of the most significant pack alliance in the region." "Yes," he said. "That is going to complicate the Dorian situation considerably," she said. "Or simplify it," he said. She considered this. "I have not decided which, but I am going to think about it." She straightened up from the counter. "Come back this afternoon, if you want. There is more I want to know about the formal legal structure of the 5-Territory Council, and how binding contract disputes are handled within it." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she thought might be, under a great deal of careful control, the specific expression of a person who has just been given something they were not expecting, and is very pleased about it. "I will be back this afternoon," he said. "Good," she said. She turned back to her work. The afternoon passed, and the afternoon after that, and the one after that, in the particular rhythm of two people discovering that they could exist in the same space, without requiring anything of each other, that the other was not already willing to give, which is one of the rarer and more valuable things two people can discover. She showed him the scars on the third day. Not intentionally. They were reviewing one of the legal documents she had stored at the clinic, the copy she kept here, rather than at her room, and she had pulled her collar slightly aside to read a notation she had made on the back of the folded paper, and he had seen them. The thin silver lines along her throat where the collar had pressed for 20 years, and the marks from the night she had broken it, which had faded but not disappeared. He did not look away. He also did not comment immediately, which was the correct response. He waited until she had read the notation, and then he said, quietly, "The lines from the bite are yours." "Yes," she said. "You did that to get free." "Yes." He looked at them for another moment, then looked back at the document. He did not offer to have the scars treated or reduced, which would have been the wrong thing to say, and he did not make an expression of distress about them, which would also have been the wrong thing. He simply recognized what he was seeing and placed it where it belonged, which was in the category of things that had happened and that were part of who she was and that required no correction. She had expected the moment to be more difficult. It was not. On the 5th day, She took her documents out of their secure location and spread them on the clinic table and showed him everything. The testimonies from the 9 individuals, the 3 other binding contracts, the legal analysis she had built over years, cross-referencing PAC law across 4 different territorial systems, and the older common accords that predated the 5-territory alliance. He read all of it carefully. He asked precise questions, which she answered. He identified 2 points in the argument that she had also flagged as potentially weak, and they discussed those for a long time, and arrived at the same conclusions she had already reached about how to address them. At the end, he looked at her across the table and said, "This is extraordinary work." "It took 10 years, she said. "It is still extraordinary," he said. She looked at her documents. At the evidence she had built, quietly and methodically, across a decade of living under a different name, and holding her fire, and gathering everything she would need. At the case that was solid enough, she had known for a while, to bring before the right body, in the right context. She had been waiting, she admitted to herself, for the right moment, for something that gave her the standing to bring it formally, in a setting where it could not simply be dismissed by the same PAC authorities who had ratified the original contract. She had been waiting, though she had not fully framed it this way until now, for exactly the kind of formal authority that happened to be sitting across the table from her. She said, "I want to present this formally, in the right setting, with the right authority present." The 5-territory council would be the appropriate body, he said. A formal challenge to a binding contract, made across territorial lines, falls within their jurisdiction. Can that be convened? "I am the Alpha King of the 5-territory alliance," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "I want to present it myself. I am not submitting it through you or through the council structure as a petition. I am walking in and presenting it as a formal legal challenge, in my own name, and I am standing on the outcome of it." "That is what I assumed," he said. There was no negotiation in his voice, just confirmation. "Then we need to talk about timing," she said, "because Dorian Blackthorne has been looking for me for 10 years too, and now that you have found me, the chances of his finding me have increased. I would prefer to do this on my terms, at a time I choose, not because I was cornered." "Agreed," he said. "What do you need? 2 weeks? A month?" She thought about it. 2 weeks. I need to get my documents in order, have certified copies made, and brief the 9 individuals who gave testimony so they understand what is happening. 2 weeks, he said. "I will arrange the council session." She looked at him across the table. The clinic was quiet. The afternoon light was coming through the window. The bond sat between them, warm and patient, not requiring anything, which she was still getting used to, but which was, she was beginning to understand, perhaps the most significant thing about it. She said, "Thank you." It was not a complicated thing to say, but she meant it fully, and she said it fully, and he heard it that way, and neither of them made more of it than it was. They did not get 2 weeks. Word arrived 11 days into the arrangement, carried by a rider from the northern border post, addressed to Calum, in formal Blackthorne clan script, and bearing a seal she recognized from the official documents she had studied in Crest Study 15 years ago. She was at the clinic when Calum brought it in, and she saw the seal before she read the contents, and she understood immediately what it meant. Dorian Blackthorne had found her. Not precisely, not yet, but he had found enough. The letter was formal in the way that threats are formal when they are being made by powerful men who know the right language. It invoked the original mating contract, referenced it by date and council seal number, and stated that the Blackthorne clan had received information, placing its contracted party in the southern neutral territory, and was formally requesting that the 5-territory council recognize the binding's continued validity and assist in its completion. It named the Alpha King by title and requested a formal response within 5 days. It did not name her. It referred to her as the contracted party, as if she were a clause rather than a person. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the clinic table and stood with her hands flat on the surface and looked at it. Calum stood across the table. He did not speak, which was the correct decision. She said, "He found us because he found you." "Yes," Calum said. "Someone in the neutral territory recognized Felix or his riders and connected them to the alliance." Word moved quickly. "Of course it did," she said. She looked at the letter. He has taken this to the council level, which means if I do not respond on my own terms, the council is going to receive his version of this situation as the first version, and that will shape how they hear everything else. That is correct, Calum said, which is why we are not waiting 5 days. She looked at him. What are you thinking? I am thinking we call the session now, he said. Today. I send the notifications tonight. We convene in 3 days at the Border Territory Keep, which is the standard neutral ground for 5 territory council sessions, and I invite every alpha in the alliance and every senior council representative. He paused. And Dorian Blackthorne. We invite him formally, because if he is not present when this is resolved, he will argue later that he was not given the opportunity to respond. She thought about this. 3 days instead of 11. She had been planning for 11. She had imagined arriving at the summit with everything perfectly organized, every document in exact order, every argument rehearsed and ready. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at the files she had spent 10 years building. She looked at the careful, meticulous work of a person who had been preparing for exactly this moment, for longer than most people prepare for anything. She said, 3 days is enough. Are you certain? He said. I have been certain of this argument for 3 years, she said. I have just been waiting for the right venue. 3 days is enough. He sent the notifications that night. Wren arrived in Ashvale the next morning with a small formal escort to travel with them to the border keep, and he was introduced to Serafina with the particular careful politeness of a man who has been told a great deal about a person and is trying to not let all of it show immediately on his face. She shook his hand and told him she was familiar with the role he had played in the searching, and he said, with a directness she appreciated, that he was glad she had been found, and that he hoped the next few days went well. She said she intended to make sure they did. The Border Territory Keep was a large stone structure set at the exact boundary of 3 territories, which was why it was used for alliance sessions. It had a great hall with long tables and enough seating for every alpha representative and their delegations. And it had, along its north wall, a specific protocol of reception that meant every person who arrived was formally announced before entering. She arrived with Calum. She walked in beside him and not behind him, which she had specified before they left Ashvale, and he had said of course without making it a more complicated moment than it needed to be. Dorian Blackthorne was already there. She saw him across the great hall as she came through the doors, and she felt the particular cold clarity that she had first learned to call on when Owen had said something cruel in the yard when she was 12, the cold clarity that came from choosing not to feel what she was feeling right now, and choosing instead to see accurately. He saw her at the same moment. She watched the recognition hit him. She watched him start to move toward her, and then stop. Because Calum was beside her, and because the formal protocol of the session meant that direct approach before the session opened was against procedure. She gave him a single nod, nothing more. Then she turned and went to her assigned position at the table, which was the presenting position, the seat reserved for whoever was bringing the formal matter to the council. The session opened. Leon, as senior council representative, stated the matter before the body. The Blackthorne clan's formal request regarding the contract in question. The counter-presentation to be given by the individual named in that contract. He said her name, her full name, Serafina Voss of the Iron Blood Pack. The room was very quiet for a moment. She heard the name in the great hall the way you hear a name that has been kept small for 10 years, suddenly given all the space it was always supposed to have. It was a different sound than she had expected. She stood. She placed the 3 pieces of the broken collar on the table in the center of the room. There was not a single sound in the great hall when she did it. She said, I am Serafina Voss. This is the binding placed on my throat at birth, without my knowledge or consent, by a craftsman hired by my father, in conjunction with the Iron Blood Pack Elder Council, in accordance with a contract negotiated with the Blackthorne clan, by men who were acting in what they described as the interests of the pack. She looked around the room, at the alpha representatives, at the council members, at Dorian Blackthorne. I wore this for 20 years. I broke it with my own hands when I was 20 years old, and I have been in the neutral territories since that night, building the case I am about to present to you. She opened her folder. She presented the case clearly and methodically, the way she had organized it, beginning with the historical legal argument and moving to the specific evidence. She cited the older common accords that predated the five-territory alliance and that established foundational rights of consent in binding contracts. She cited the specific language in those accords that made contracts negotiated on behalf of individuals who lacked the capacity to consent legally void from their inception. She cited the clause in the original contract that stated it was enforceable regardless of the willingness of either party, and she cited the three other binding contracts she had collected that used the same or similar language, showing it as a pattern rather than an isolated instance. She presented the testimony, 9 individuals, each one a person who had been bound through a contract they had not agreed to, each one with their own story, that was, in the specific details and the general shape, recognizable to anyone in the room who was willing to let themselves recognize it. She laid out her argument with the precision of someone who had spent 10 years preparing it, who had read every version of the counter-argument, who had found every potential weakness and addressed it. When she finished, the hall was quiet. Dorian stood. His voice was controlled, but the control was working hard. He invoked the original contract by date and seal. He cited the peace that the contract had secured. He said that the contract had been legally constituted by the relevant authorities at the time, and that whatever technical arguments might be raised against its original formation, it had been in place and recognized for 20 years. She let him finish. Then she said, "The question before this council is not whether the contract was recognized. The question is whether it was valid when it was made. A recognized thing and a valid thing are not the same. A forgery that has been passed as currency for 20 years is still a forgery." Several of the Alpha representatives shifted in their seats. One of them, a woman from the Eastern Territory named Aldra, who had been listening throughout, with an intensity that Serafina had noted, said, "On the question of the original consent requirement, the accords you cited place the burden of proof on the contracting party to demonstrate that the individual had the capacity to consent. How does the Blackthorn clan establish that capacity in this case?" Dorian said, "The contract was signed by her father as her legal representative." Serafina said, "I was 12 minutes old. My father had the legal standing of a representative under PAC law in that context, but only in matters where the representation was in the individual's interest. A contract that permanently binds an individual against their future will is not, under any reasonable reading of the relevant accords, in the individual's interest. It is in the contracting party's interest. Those are different things." She looked around the room. The accords distinguish between representation and ownership. My father represented the PAC's interests. He did not represent mine. The discussion continued for 2 hours. It was detailed and sometimes heated, and Serafina answered every question that was directed at her, and several that were directed at Calum, with a precision that did not leave room for misinterpretation. Dorian's arguments narrowed over the course of those 2 hours. She watched them narrow, the way arguments narrow when they are being examined carefully, losing the pieces that cannot hold weight under scrutiny. By the end of the second hour, he was down to a single remaining argument, which was precedent, which was the idea that the Alliance had a history of recognizing these kinds of contracts, and that changing course now created instability. It was the weakest version of the argument. She had planned for it. She said, "Precedent is not permanence. Every reform this alliance has ever made overturned a precedent. The relevant question is not whether something has always been done. The relevant question is whether it should continue to be done." Dorian stepped toward her. He stepped toward her with the look of a man who has run out of legal ground and is defaulting to something older and less formal. She moved first. She was faster than he expected, which was something she had counted on. She had been faster than most people expected her entire life. She caught his arm as he reached for her, and she redirected his momentum cleanly, using his own forward motion, and he went down to one knee, with his arm behind him, and her hand keeping it there, and the room went very still. She was not breathing hard. The wolves of the Alpha Council were all on their feet, but none of them were moving, because there was nothing in what she was doing that required intervention. She had simply stopped something from happening, and was holding it stopped. She looked down at Dorian. She said, quietly, so that only he and the immediately surrounding council members could hear, "You were told the contract was valid. I understand that. But it was not. And you are going to let go of this now, because the alternative is a formal challenge process, in which I present everything I know about the Blackthorn clan's history, with non-consensual binding contracts, and there are 3 other cases in my folder with Blackthorn seals on them." She looked at him steadily. Let it go. He was very still. Then he nodded once. She released his arm and stepped back and looked at the council. Leon cleared his throat. He said, in the formal council voice, "The matter before this body will be decided by formal vote. All representatives will remain." She sat back down at the presenting table. She folded her hands on the documents in front of her. She was not cold. She was completely, entirely present in the room. The vote took 30 minutes. When the result was read, it was 12 in favor of the formal motion to declare the binding contract invalid and void from its original formation, and 2 abstaining. Dorian Blackthorne left the Great Hall before the formal session closed. She watched him go. She did not feel triumph exactly. She felt the specific completeness of a thing that has been carried for a very long time, finally being put down in the right place. She gathered her documents. Calum was beside her, not in front of her. He said, quietly, "How are you?" She thought about this. "I am better than I was 3 days ago," she said, "which is better than yesterday, which was better than last week." She looked at him. "Ask me again in a month." "I will," he said. She picked up the 3 pieces of the broken collar from the center of the table. She looked at them in her hands for a moment. She put them back in the cloth pouch where she had kept them for 10 years. Then she put them in her bag. They were still evidence. There was still work to do with them. The formal council ruling was announced publicly 3 days after the session closed. The original binding contract between the Iron Blood Pack and the Blackthorn clan, sealed in the year of Serafina Voss's birth, was declared void and without legal standing. The language was specific and the public record was detailed, because she had insisted on specificity and detail, not the vague language of settlements that leave things ambiguous enough to be argued about later. The ruling named the contract's specific flaws. It named the accords that had been violated. It was on the record. Dorian Blackthorne's formal alpha status within the Blackthorn clan structure was suspended, pending a review of the 3 additional cases she had presented, the ones with Blackthorn seals. That review would take time. She had given the council copies of everything she had, and she had given the 9 individuals whose testimonies she had collected the contact information for the council's formal inquiry process. She was not in charge of the review. She was not supposed to be. Her part was the evidence and the argument. The rest was up to the process she had forced into existence. Crest Voss received a formal notification from the Iron Blood Pack Elder Council that his role in the original contract was under internal review. She had sent the documentation to the Northern Pack herself, through the formal inter-pack communication channel, addressed to the current senior elder. She had not addressed it to Crest. She had not written to Crest at all. What happened within the Iron Blood Pack's internal process was their business, and she had provided them the information they needed to conduct it honestly. She thought about her mother the morning the notifications went out. She thought about Mira in the kitchen, trimming the garden plants with her back to the house, telling Serafina to go completely, and not write, and not send word. She thought about what it must have cost Mira, in the years since, to not know. She wrote a letter that afternoon, not to Crest, to Mira. She sent it through a neutral territory courier service that operated independently of pack channels and was reliably private. She told Mira that she was well, that she was in the neutral territory and had a life there that was hers, that the contract was being dealt with, that she thought about Ada's words often. It did not put a return address. She thought Mira would understand why. She went back to Ashvale after the council session. She went back to the clinic. She told Nora the full story over 2 cups of tea in the back room one evening, and Nora listened through all of it without interrupting, which was an impressive thing given Nora's general tendencies toward commentary. And when Serafina finished, Nora was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I always thought the Central Plains story was not quite right." "I know," Sarah said. "Sarah Wynne is a good name," Nora said. "You can keep using it here, if you want. The town knows you as Sarah." "I think I will use both," Serafina said. "Serafina Voss for formal things, Sarah Wynne for the clinic." Nora nodded, as if this were entirely practical, and moved on, which was why Serafina had kept her in her life for 4 years. Calum stayed in Ashvale. He had responsibilities that required him to travel periodically, and he traveled and came back, and she did not ask him to arrange his schedule differently, and he did not ask her to change hers, and the arrangement was, she found, something she could exist within, without feeling constrained by it. which was not something she had expected to feel about any arrangement involving another person's sustained presence in her life. They talked a great deal. The conversations were wide-ranging, because both of them had spent significant amounts of time thinking about significant numbers of things, and they turned out to have the kind of minds that sharpened against each other productively. They disagreed on several topics of substance, and discussed those disagreements without either person deciding the disagreement was a problem to be resolved by one of them changing their position. She found that she liked him, not just as the person connected to the bond, but as a specific individual person with specific qualities. His directness, his patience, which was genuine rather than performed, the way he listened, which was the same way she listened, actively and completely, without the background preparation of his own next response running while he was still hearing what she said. She was careful with the trust. She was careful in the way she had always been careful, building it on observation and experience rather than on the pressure of feeling or the convenience of wanting it to already exist. She watched him in situations that tested what he was. She watched him with Ren, where the dynamic was easy and honest in the way that dynamics between people who have known each other for a very long time become easy. She watched him with the council, where he was capable of the kind of authority required without it changing how he was when he was not performing authority. She watched him disagree with her and stay respectful. She watched him be wrong about something and correct himself without difficulty. She watched him, and what she saw was consistent, and consistency was the thing she trusted. There was a night, about 6 weeks after the council session, when they were sitting outside the clinic after it had closed, in the small space behind the building, where there was a bench, and where the sound of the market district was muffled enough to be pleasant background rather than foreground noise. He was telling her something about a territorial negotiation that had been ongoing for the past 3 years, and that had reached an interesting development that week. She was listening and watching the sky go from late gold to early dark. She said, in a gap in the conversation, "I let myself feel the bond today." He stopped. He looked at her. She said, "Not in the way I have been letting it exist, which is present but at a careful distance. I let myself actually feel it. For about 20 minutes, while I was working, I let it be completely there." He did not say anything. She said, "It does not feel like a trap." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "What does it feel like?" She thought about how to say it accurately. "Like something that is mine," she said. "Not something that happened to me or that I was assigned. Like something that belongs to me." She paused. "That is the first time anything associated with bonding has felt that way." "I know," he said. He said it with the weight of someone who understood what it meant. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I am not telling you that everything is resolved. It is not. I have months of work left with the council review, and the Blackthorn cases, and my father's situation. I have things I still need to sort out about what my life looks like going forward, and where I want it to be." She paused. "What I am telling you is that I am not running anymore, from any of it, including this." He looked at her steadily. "That is everything," he said. "No," she said. "It is a beginning, but it is a real one." They sat outside the clinic in the evening, while the sky went dark and the market district settled into its nighttime sounds, and neither of them needed to fill the quiet with anything, because the quiet was already full. There were still the 3 pieces of the broken collar in her bag. She had been carrying them for 10 years. She took them out one morning, alone in her room, and she looked at them for a long time, the broken pieces of moonsilver, the dead runes along the surface, the evidence of what had been done, and the evidence of what she had done about it. She put them in a small wooden box. She put the box on the shelf where she kept her most important things, in plain sight, not hidden. Not hidden anymore. One of the 9 individuals whose testimonies she had collected, a woman named Aldra from the eastern border, came to Ashvale 2 months after the council session to speak with her in person. Aldra had given her testimony 2 years ago, through a written account delivered by hand, and they had never met face to face. She was in her late 30s, a practical woman, with a background in trade law, and she had her own story, which was different in the specific details and completely recognizable in the shape of it. They sat in the clinic and talked for 4 hours. By the end of the conversation, Aldra had raised something that Serafina had been turning over in her mind since the council session, which was the question of what came after a ruling. The ruling declared the contracts void. The ruling put Dorian's formal status on review. The ruling created a record, but it did not, by itself, create a system. It did not create any formal mechanism by which future contracts of the same kind would be prevented, or by which the people who had been affected by existing ones could access formal redress. The ruling is a precedent, Aldra said, but precedents sit in a drawer until someone brings them out. What you need is a standing body. Serafina looked at her. A council. A council, Aldra agreed, with a defined scope, with the formal authority to receive complaints and review binding contracts against the relevant accords, with teeth, meaning the ability to act on its findings rather than simply record them. The 5-territory council would need to ratify it, Serafina said. Yes, Aldra said. Do you have access to that conversation? Serafina thought about the man who had been present for the past 2 months in Ashvale, and who had, on multiple occasions, asked her what she thought about various matters that fell within the council's scope, not as a way of asking her to handle them, but as a way of genuinely wanting to know what she thought. Yes, she said, I have access to that conversation. She raised it with Calum that evening. She laid out the proposal in the same methodical way she laid everything out, beginning with the problem statement and moving through the proposed solution and the specific elements that would need to be defined and ratified. He listened, and he asked precise questions, and when she was done he said, I think this is the right next step. The ruling without the mechanism is incomplete. I want to help draft it, she said. Not observe the process from the outside, draft it. I assumed that too, he said. They worked on the proposal for 3 weeks. They worked on it together, which was a different experience from anything she had worked on alone. Not because his contribution was more than hers, but because the back and forth of 2 people who were thinking carefully about the same problem, and who were willing to challenge each other's assumptions, as well as agree with each other's reasoning, produced something that was better than what either of them would have written separately. She presented the proposal to the council 2 months after the first conversation with Aldra. She presented it herself, in her own name, as its primary author. She sat at the presenting table in the same great hall where she had placed the broken collar on the wood, and she made the case for the Accord Council, which was what she had named it, in the same detailed and precise way she had made the case against the contract. The vote was 13 in favor and 2 abstaining. The Accord Council was formally established. She was asked to serve as its chair. She accepted, on the specific condition that the role was defined as a term appointment with a fixed end date and a formal transition structure, because she had no interest in positions that became permanent, simply because there was no defined mechanism to end them. The council agreed to this condition without debate, which told her that the people in that room had been listening carefully enough to understand why she was asking for it. She was 31 years old. She had been free for 11 years, which she did not count as the official start date anymore. She counted from the day of the council ruling, which was the day the last formal claim on her became officially and permanently invalid. She was aware that this was a somewhat arbitrary reckoning, but she thought she was entitled to pick her own start date for her own life, and she picked that one. She called on Ada's words regularly, not as a comfort or a talisman, but as a tool. When she was in a difficult meeting, or in the middle of an argument that was not going the way she wanted, or in the parts of the work that were tedious and unglamorous and which still needed to be done, she would bring the words to the front of her mind and let them sit there for a moment. They collared you because they saw what you would become. What she had become was, in the end, exactly what they had been afraid of. Someone who understood the systems they built and how to dismantle the parts of them that should not have been built in the first place. Someone who gathered evidence with the patience of a person who has learned that patience and thoroughness are the same thing. Someone who stood in rooms full of people with authority and spoke in a way that made them listen. The collar had tried to make her something smaller. All it had succeeded in doing was ensuring that she spent 20 years building the inner resources of a person who would eventually have no use for it. She thought about Mira. She had received no response to the letter, which was expected and correct. But she thought about her mother regularly, in the particular way you think about someone who gave you the most important things you carry, quietly and completely, and with the understanding that the debt is the kind you can never repay and are also never expected to. One day, she thought, when the right time existed and the right conditions existed, and her life had enough stability around it that a connection could be re-established without putting anyone at risk. Not yet, but one day. The Accord Council held its first formal session in early spring. Almost exactly 1 year after the evening in the clinic, when Serafina had placed the broken collar on the table in the great hall, and changed the direction of her own life on purpose rather than by necessity. The hall was full, not just with the 5 territory council members, but with observers, representatives from smaller pack structures, who did not fall within the alliance's formal jurisdiction, but who were present because they had heard what the council was now doing and wanted to understand it. There were also, sitting in the back rows, several of the individuals whose cases were now formally under the Accord Council's review. They had come to watch the body that existed, in significant part, because of what they had experienced and what they had been willing to put into writing. Serafina opened the session. She stood at the front of the room and looked out at it, at the full range of what had assembled here, and she felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Not triumph, which was too loud a word for it. Not satisfaction, which was too simple. Something that was closer to a reckoning, with the distance between where she had been and where she was standing now. A measuring of that distance not with grief or anger, but with a clear, steady comprehension of what it had taken to cross it. She said, "This council exists to address something that should not have needed addressing, which is the question of whether people have the right to determine what bindings they enter into. The answer to that question is not new. It is not something we are inventing here today. It has always been true. What is new is the formal mechanism by which this body will hold that truth accountable when others choose to ignore it." She outlined the council's mandate, its scope, which covered binding contracts made across territorial lines and within pack structures where individuals had not provided meaningful consent. Its process, which was formal and evidence-based and transparent in the way that processes need to be transparent in order to be trusted. Its relationship to the 5 territory council, which was defined carefully so that it had genuine authority, without overreaching into matters that belonged to separate jurisdictions. She presented the first 3 cases on the formal docket. Each case had been reviewed by the full council before the session. She did not present them alone. Aldra was at the table. 2 other council members, one of them a young man named Felix who had a background in interpack legal agreements and a precise, methodical mind she had appreciated during the drafting process, sat at the presenting table as well. The session lasted 4 hours. It was precise, and sometimes difficult, and occasionally heated in the way that things are heated when they matter enough to produce friction. At the end of it, the council had issued formal findings on the 3 cases, and established the formal review process for the additional 11 cases currently in the docket. When the session closed and the hall began to empty, Serafina stood for a moment at the front of the room and looked at the people filing out, at the observers who had come to watch and who were leaving with something to take back to their own territories, at the individuals from the back rows who stopped to speak quietly with members of the council on their way out, at Aldra, across the room, who caught her eye and gave a brief, clear nod that communicated precisely what it was intended to communicate. Calum was by the door, on the far side of the room. He had been in the session as an observer, not as a participant, because she had been specific about the distinction. This was her work. His role in the room was his role in the room, because she had asked for it, which was to say, he was there because she had asked him to be there, not because the position he held entitled him to be. He understood this, and had never needed it explained more than once. He looked at her from across the room. She looked back. The expression she gave him was small and specific, the kind that exists between 2 people who have been paying careful attention to each other for long enough to have a private language made of small, specific things. He matched it. She left the hall. That evening she went to the forest at the edge of the northern boundary of the territory where the council keep was located, because the keep was in a different place than Ashvale, and the forest here was older and darker, and the trees were the kind of trees that have been in one place long enough to feel like permanent features of the world. She shifted. She had been shifting freely for almost a year now, ever since the period after the council session when the last of the collar's residual effects on her biology had fully cleared. The first full shift had taken a while, because 20 years of suppression had left her wolf with some adjustments to make, some relearning of what its full range felt like. But those adjustments had been made, with the patient, thorough approach she brought to all adjustments, and now the shift was easy. Now it was what it was always supposed to have been. She ran through the dark forest. She ran the way she had never been able to run before, fully and freely, and without anything pressing against the expression of it. her wolf exactly itself in the cold spring night, moving through the old trees at the speed that was its natural speed without any wall to stop short of. The forest was large, and the night was dark, and the stars above the canopy were the same stars she had read by her mother's teaching in the mountains of her childhood, and she ran under them with the particular joy of a thing that has finally been permitted to be what it is. She ran for a long time. The forest held the sound of her passage and then released it, leaving only the ordinary sounds of night. When she came back to the clearing near the tree line, she shifted back and stood in the dark and breathed. The air was cold. The lights of the keep were visible in the distance. Her throat was bare in the night air, the way it had been bare for 11 years, the scars along it visible to anyone who looked closely, and invisible to anyone who did not. She put her hand to her throat, not to cover the scars but simply to feel that they were there. The thin silver lines that were what remained of 20 years, and a craftsman's burned hands, and a decision made in a room where no one asked her anything. She was not angry at the scars. She had not been angry at them for a while. They were information. They were a record that she carried in her skin rather than in a folder, and she had decided they were a record worth keeping rather than hiding, because they were the clearest evidence she had of what had happened and of what she had done about it. She thought about a Tuesday afternoon in a kitchen, and an old woman who sat down without being invited, and asked to see a child, and held that child, and looked at her for a long time, and said something to her that the child could not understand, but whose bones absorbed like water, absorbing into stone. They collared you because they saw what you would become. She stood in the dark at the forest edge and let herself be what she had become. The Accord Council. The formal legal framework she had helped write. The 11 cases currently in process. The people in the back of the hall today who had come to watch something exist that had not existed before, and that existed because of what she had been willing to do with 10 years of running and gathering and waiting for the right moment. The bond in her chest, warm and constant, pulling gently toward the lights of the keep where Caleb was waiting, without having sent a message asking where she was, because he trusted her to come back when she was ready, and not because he told her to. The name she used in formal settings, Serafina Voss. The name her mother had kept in a boot for months and set against a small ear in the first minutes of life. Serafina. Radiant. Burning. Alive. She thought about the seer's words one more time, and this time she thought about them differently. They had collared her because they saw what she would become. They had looked at the bloodline reading and understood what it meant, and responded to that understanding with metal and runes and a contract and 20 years of suppression. They had tried, with all the tools available to them, to manage the thing they were afraid of before it fully arrived. She stood at the edge of the forest with the cold spring night around her, 31 years old, with her throat bare, and her wolf settled, and her name restored, and 11 cases on the council's docket, and the bond pointing toward the lights of the keep, and the 3 pieces of a broken collar on the shelf in her room at home. They had failed. Not because they were weak, or foolish, or incompetent. They had been none of those things. They had failed because the thing they were afraid of was not, in the end, the kind of thing that could be stopped by the means they used to try to stop it. Not by metal. Not by runes. Not by contracts signed without her. Not by 20 years of managed suppression. Not by riders sent south and legal letters citing old authorities. The thing they had been afraid of was not her strength, exactly, though she had that. It was not her wolf, though she had that too. It was something underneath both of those things, the part of her that had stood in a guest wing room at the age of 20, and understood that there was no version of stopping that she wanted to exist in, and had acted accordingly. The thing they had been afraid of was her refusal to accept what had been decided for her. And that was not something you could collar. That was not something that suppressed. That was not something that responded to the force of old runes, or the authority of councils she had not sat on, or the certainty of men who had made their decisions in rooms she was not invited into. That was simply who she was. It had always been who she was. The collar had delayed it, in the same way that winter delays spring, which is to say it had delayed it completely, and accomplished nothing permanent. She turned and walked toward the lights of the keep. Behind her, the forest settled back into its dark, ordinary silence. The trees stood in the way that old trees stand, without requiring anything from the night around them, simply present and rooted and entirely themselves. She walked across the open ground toward the light, and she did not look back once. She found Calum in the small sitting room off the main hall, exactly where he tended to be in quiet evenings, with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and a document he was reading with the focused attention he brought to reading, which was the same quality of attention he brought to most things worth paying attention to. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face for a moment and then said, "Good run?" "Very," she said. She sat across from him and pulled her legs up and settled into the chair. The fire in the room was steady and warm, and the room had the particular comfort of a space that two people have occupied often enough that it has started to carry the particular warmth of their combined habits. She looked at him across the room. "Can I tell you something?" "Yes," he said, and put the document down. "When the session closed today, and I was standing at the front of the room," she said, "I thought about the night I was born. The specific physical fact of someone welding metal around the throat of a child who had been alive for less than an hour. The specific confidence required to do that to another person." She was quiet for a moment. "I have spent 11 years being angry about it, in the various forms anger takes over time. Rage, then bitterness, then the cold functional version of it that I carried through the neutral territory while I was building the case. And today, standing there, I was not any of those things." He was listening. "I am not saying the anger was wrong," she said. "It was not wrong. It was accurate. But what I felt today was not anger. It was closer to the end of something. Like a calculation that has been running for a very long time finally completing." She looked at him. "I do not think I have felt that before." He said, "What did it feel like?" She thought about this honestly. "Like the beginning of something different," she said. "Not new. Different." She paused. "Like the opening of a part of the day that comes after the work is done. Which is not nothing. That part of the day is not nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "it is not nothing." She looked at the fire for a while. Then she said, "I wrote to my mother, before the council session. I told her what was happening. I told her I was well." "Good," he said. "I did not put a return address," she said. "But I think, at some point, when things are more settled, and when the timing is right, and when I have thought about it more carefully, I would like to find a way to see her." She paused. "Not return to the northern mountains. That is not something I am planning. But Mira did not make the contract. She fought it as much as she was able to fight it. She spent years preparing me for what I would need. She deserves to know that the preparation worked." "When you are ready," Calum said. "Whatever that looks like, and whenever it happens." She looked at him. She said, "Do you understand that the things I am telling you right now, in this room, are things I have not told anyone else in the past 11 years?" "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. "I want you to know that I am aware of what it means, that I am choosing it deliberately." She looked at the fire. "I do not have a comfortable and easy version of trust. I have never had one. I have the version that builds on evidence over time, and the evidence has been good, and so the trust exists. And I want you to know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The trust means more than you know, not because I needed you to reach it, but because I know how hard it was, and what it cost you to arrive here." He looked at her. "And because it is yours to give, and you chose to give it, and that is the only version of it I wanted." She held his gaze. She thought about the night in the clinic, when she had looked at him for 1 second and then looked away. She thought about the forest edge in the dark, and the conversation that had been raw and difficult, and had gone on, until both of them had said the true things, and not the easy things. She thought about the documents on the clinic table, and the 10 years of careful work that had preceded them, and the man who had read all of it, and said it was extraordinary, and meant it. She thought about her wolf, loose and free in the dark forest, running at its full speed under the stars. She said, "I am very glad you did not leave Ashvale." He said, "I am very glad you closed the clinic later than you said you would." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Tomorrow the council reconvenes for the second set of cases. I need to review the files tonight." "I know," he said. He picked up his document. She picked up the folder from the table beside her chair. The fire burned. The room was warm. The night was quiet outside the windows. They worked in the comfortable, specific silence of two people who have learned what the other person needs from a shared quiet and are able to provide it without discussion, which is one of the rarer things two people can build, and one of the most permanent once it exists. In the morning the council would meet again. In the morning, There were 11 cases waiting, and 3 that were being heard this week, and a legal framework that was still being refined in the places where it needed refining. There was work ahead, significant work, the kind that does not end quickly and is not supposed to. She was not afraid of it. She was not afraid of the work, or the difficulty of it, or the time it would take. She had spent 20 years learning patience, and 11 years learning what patience was for, and she knew, sitting in the warm room with the fire, and the document on her lap, and the bond steady and present in her chest, that she had enough of both to do what needed to be done. They had collared her, because they saw what she would become. Now, at last, she had become it, and the collar, in 3 broken pieces in a box on a shelf in her room, was simply the evidence of the distance between what they had tried to make of her and what she had always been going to be, waiting there quietly in its box, as small and contained and finished as it deserved to be.